The purpose of a visit to the Holy Land for Catholics or Orthodox or Copts and other offshoots of the Roman Church is a pilgrimage, which means to visit, to pray, and perform rituals in places declared as holy sites by those churches. That is the definition of pilgrimage, not what evangelicals do. Protestants, Lutherans, Calvinists, Anglicans, Presbyterians, and most Methodists, they still mostly define their visit to this country as a pilgrimage and come to visit mostly the traditional sites, with the addition of a very few modern ones, and to perform the Lord's Supper or to have communion at either one of these sites or one of their own church's centers, if their church has a center here, to read scripture, but almost entirely from the New Testament. And this is completely and distinctly not what evangelicals hope for in a visit to come to this country. Evangelicals seek scriptural enrichment and spiritual fulfillment through better understanding of the land, the characters, and the events of the Bible. It's especially enriching for evangelicals if they can achieve an improved understanding of the geography, the topography, the climate, and the cultures of the land of Israel in the biblical times, not now, in the biblical times, to be able to compare and adjust the preconceptions that they brought from home far away when they'd never seen the land before. Taking in and connecting with the land with the scriptures can give many, many evangelicals a feeling of being closer to God than they've ever experienced. Every evangelical knows that Jesus the man was not from outer space. They know he was not a stranger to his world of his time. Every evangelical knows that Jesus was born a Jew to Jewish parents who were observant of Torah. They know it was a Jewish family during the late Second Temple period. They know he was circumcised as a Jew, and he went to Jerusalem as a Jew. Every evangelical knows that the only Bible that Jesus ever knew was the Hebrew one, referred to as the Old Testament. Evangelicals need to be guided in the light of all this. They are not dumb pilgrims. This is just something to look at, which I think is pretty cute. You'll see this sort of thing around, especially, well, this is from the USA. They put up billboards, they put up announcement boards saying what's going on or a message from the scripture. This is one that's in a Baptist church. Mary was not Catholic. John was not Baptist. And Jesus was not a Christian. They were all Jewish. Actually, Jesus can't be a Christian because you can't be a follower of yourself. Christian means of the followers of the Anointed One. So, evangelicals, visits to sites, authentic versus traditional. Problems with delivering on an evangelical visit to Israel. The itineraries of many tourism wholesalers abroad, which are then fixed through the local travel agencies, unfortunately send many evangelical groups to traditional Catholic and unorthodox sites, often for reasons of budget, and adding only a few free sites and perhaps the Garden Tomb. For many evangelical groups, the Garden Tomb comes in place of the Holy Sepulchre. These itineraries are often largely unchanged since 1967. New archaeological sites, many associated clearly with biblical eras, are not included in the itinerary, perhaps as not many are free sites, but also because of a view that this has worked as it is till now, we're not going to change a good thing. This policy frustrates many evangelical visitors who return home with a feeling of having missed on what they sought out when they came here. Evangelical visitors are often horrified by what they see as false worship in sites, kissing and praying at statues and icons to Mary and the saints at traditional Christian sites, because they seek authenticity and a clear connection to the land and to the word. understand that many people, especially in certain areas where they're not all converts to evangelical Christianity, but like in the southeast of the United States, they live in communities where they don't see anyone who is not, well, some are atheists, of course, but who are not evangelicals. Some of them have never set foot in an Orthodox church in their life, or some of them never set foot in a Catholic church in their life. And what they see is beyond their understanding. So taking them to those places here is totally wrong. However, if I go back to this on the first section here, if you get an evangelical family or couple or individual or even small group who connects to you directly through the internet or through a small agency that says, I've thought of this itinerary, what do you think? Then you have the opportunity to deliver them the experience of a lifetime. How to view the biblical related sites with evangelicals. With evangelicals, it's important to be precise and to be real, not to make up stories. We'll divide these sites into 3 categories, which I got from Omer Eshel, A, B, and C. An inspiring evangelical tour needs to be mostly A sites, some B, and very few or no C sites at all. So what are they? What is this A, B, C? A sites. These are the sites with the earliest tradition, at least the 2nd century BC. In other words, at least within 100 years of the let's say the resurrection, the crucifixion. If it's more than 100 years, then it's not first-hand tradition. Now, why do I say first-hand? Because if when you're a child, your grandparent takes you and shows you a place and says, you know what happened here when I was young? Such and such happened here. You're getting that firsthand. And when you then give that to your grandchild, you've covered more than 100 years. They will have covered more than 100 years. And they are still getting firsthand information that you get from your grandfather. So for them, it's secondhand, but it's still firsthand. It's still valid information. So if we have traditions that go back to the early 2nd century, if we have a site where the topography and geography completely perfectly matches the biblical narrative and being realistic, and if we also have a backup of archaeological evidence, these are sites which are undoubtedly authentic sites. There's no question that this is the place. And the examples of these are as follows. The cave of Machpelah, the cave of the patriarchs in Hebron, the southern temple Mount Steps, the city of David and the Shiloach, the Siloam pool, the Kidron Valley, the Ben Hinnom Valley, Herodium, the Elah Valley, the ancient tells, Tel Jezreel, Tel Megiddo, Tel Hatzor, Tel Dan, Tel Shiloh, Tel Bet Shemesh, Tel Azekah, Tel Sha'araim, or Chilbet Kayafa, as it's referred to by the archaeologists, Philistine Gath, Beersheba and Arad, the sites of Bet Hasda, Beth Esther in the Old City, Capernaum, Panias, and the Herodian Quarter in the Old City of Jerusalem. These are sites where there is absolutely no doubt about their authenticity. These are the places. Let's look at some examples of this. Over here, if you can see my arrow on the top left-hand corner, we've got a view from Mount Gerizim, which is the area of the Samaritan village. I'm going to a place that's called Joseph's Lookout, and lost my point. This valley here is called the Michmatat in the Bible. It's referred to by that name. This hill here, which today we call Har Kabir or Mount Kabir, has on it Elon Moreh, which is mentioned as one of the very first places in Genesis that Abraham comes to near Shechem. This is the ancient Tel Shechem, referred to as Tel Balata, but it refers to everything in the book of Genesis where Jacob is at Shechem, where Abraham comes to Shechem, and where Joseph remains are brought back by Pharaoh's men to bury him near Shechem. This is the Tel. This is the Tel. over here is the tomb of Joseph. And over here, under this modern red Orthodox church, is a deep well, which is referred to as Jacob's well. Is it Jacob's well? We don't know. We don't know. It's referred to as Jacob's well, sure. Is that expression, Jacob's well, appear anywhere in the Old Testament? No. We read about Jacob digging a well near Shechem. Now that well is 60 meters deep. I've been there. It takes 3 seconds for the water you drop from the top to go to the bottom. Okay, so is that the definite site? We don't know. Jacob didn't carve in the rock saying, I am Jacob, I left this well here. So, but it's a reasonable assumption. It's a reasonable assumption because this valley here in which the modern city of Nablus sits is not the same as ancient Shechem. Now it is because of the urban sprawl. They're sprawling up here and sprawling out here, and over here we've got Balata refugee camp, and even this area is now more built up than when I took this photo about 4 years ago. But these are authentic spots. Is this Joseph's tomb over here? We don't know. We don't know. There's no sign on it. That's 2,800. Sorry, 3,200 years old, saying this is Jacob's tomb. 3,600 years old. There isn't. We don't know. But there's a tradition on the site, and it's a very, very early tradition. So it's likely. Let's come to next. If we go up on the top picture again, if you see this hill of Mount Kabir, the next picture is taken standing over here. So down here we have what is called Nahal Tirza. This is referred to in the Hebrew scriptures, especially in the book of Genesis and later in Kings, as the way of the coming of the sun. Derech Mavor Hashemesh. You take evangelicals there, you read that scripture when they're in that site. I mean, there's no doubt that that's the valley. That is definitely the valley. It's on that ancient route that goes through the middle of, let's say, up from Caesarea, the coast. It comes through the middle of Shechem, the middle of to modern Nablus. It then takes a left up here in the top picture over here, and it goes behind this mountain, down this valley, all the way down towards the Jordan, and then slightly north and crossing at the Adam Bridge, going up the Yabok or the Jabbok ravine on the other side to the King's route. And you have got the major east-west route of the ancient world, and they're standing right next to it if they come here. This is in Sebastia, or the city that in the Hebrew Bible is referred to as Shomron. Sebastia is a much later Greek name. And these are the remains here of the palace of Achav or Ahab in Sebastia in Samaria, which he built as his capital, moving it from Tirzah. Tirzah is down here in the bottom left picture. That was the remains of it, where the Omri built the first capital and became the first capital of the Northern Kingdom. So this will become the capital of the Northern Kingdom. This is the city that will be sacked by Tiglath-Pileser III between the years 732 and 734 BC. Over here on the right, this is Sha'araim or Tel Qayafa, with the 2 gates from the specific era of the second layer here. The first layer we have from the Israelite era. We've got a second layer from much later from the Persian and later eras. But this, I lost my marker again. This hill over here, over there, where the excavations are, this is where Soko is. In the valley of Elah, it runs through the middle over here. And round to the right and behind us is Azekah, and this is where the Philistine armies were arrayed opposite the Philistine armies, opposite the Israelite armies, which came down from the region of Bethlehem to this region. So that's the valley, Elah Valley. There's no doubt about this. This is area A. This is not area A. This is site A. They're distinct, authentic sites. More examples. The Herodian quarter in Jerusalem. What we call the priestly mansions, where the incredible wealth of the late Second Temple Jerusalem priestly families can be seen in a level that in no way detracts from the level of the wealth represented in Herod's own royal palaces. That's here in the Herodian quarter, also called the Wold Museum. The southern steps of the temple. Yes, there's some modern reconstruction going on here, but these original steps that are along this area those are genuine. We know for a fact, there's just no doubt about it whatsoever, that this is from the construction of Herod the Great or the Maccabees, and that these are the steps that people ascended to go into the Temple Mount if they weren't from Jerusalem, when they would have gone in from the west. So all the stories in the Bible, think of the story of Mary and Joseph, when Jesus is 40 days old, going up through these Huldah gates, or coming down out of them, going that way, meeting Simeon. That's what these places are. These are mind-blowing places for evangelicals. The synagogue at Magdala, single layer, excavated below in two areas, below where there was no mosaic, just to see if there was an older layer. No, no older layer. This is authentic. That's the only authentic synagogue from the 1st century around the whole Sea of Galilee. Sure, up in Gamla, in Hukuk, in Wadi Hammam, in Arbel, you're going to see also remains of earlier synagogues, but not accessible easily on the general route that you take people. Magdala is. Agrippa's palace at Caesarea Philippi. There's absolutely no doubt that this is the palace of Agrippa. It wasn't Herod Philip, that built that palace. We know this from the records. It was actually Agrippa, the last king of Judah, who got all of his father's land eventually, who inherited from Philip, because Philip had no children. That was the first part of his kingdom, the Golan, and he built that palace there. We look at here at Tel Dan, the ritual site. We've got the square-shaped early foundation of an altar, which probably sits on the altar that the Bible tells us Jeroboam the first built it. We can certainly date it as far back as Jeroboam the second. And then we've got the much larger Hellenistic altar from the time of the later centuries. We're talking about up to the time of Constantine. This was a cultic site in the Hellenistic world, including throughout the time of Christ. Okay, these are genuine, tell down, genuine sites. No doubt where they are and who they were and what they belong to. No doubt whatsoever. B sites. These are sites with an early tradition from before Constantine. I repeat that, from before Constantine and Helena. Sites with partial archaeological evidence or topography of the area. Sites which cannot be fully proven as the exact precise place. Example, the Holy Sepulchre. We know that there's a burial site. We know that there are ancient tombs, many ancient, nearly 30 ancient typical Jewish slot tombs under the Holy Sepulchre. Do we know that there are others also built over slightly around the area of the Holy Sepulchre? No, we don't, because nobody's dug down below those houses. Do we know the exact single tomb marked by Helena, over which the edicule was built, is the exact precise one that Jesus' body was laid in? No, we do not. We only have tradition to tell us that what happened there was Helena put a sick woman in that tomb, and that was the only tomb she went in and came out healed. It's a tradition from 300 years after the crucifixion. It is not proof. Gethsemane. Do we know whether the site of the Catholic Church or the site of the Orthodox Gethsemane or the site of the Armenian Gethsemane? Do we know which of those is the original? Do we know which? It doesn't matter. None of them is absolutely right, because none of them has got a sign from that time saying this is where Jesus was arrested. We know the general area. We know where people who did not live in Jerusalem camped out on the Mount of Olives with their little tent or their mat for the floor to sleep on. We know roughly where this area was. I mean, people say today, well, it wasn't in the cemetery, was it? That cemetery is mostly modern from the last 200 to 500 years. Most of the burial sites were not there. So we know about Gethsemane. We don't know the exact spot. Certainly not that altar rock. That is total speculation. Theodosius was the first one to build a church there. We're talking about 390. This is like 350, 360 years after the crucifixion. The Nativity Church in Bethlehem. Was there a sign saying this is the exact cave and that's the exact spot and this is where the manger was and that's where that star says? How do we know this? Well, we do know there's an early tradition relating to the cave system in Bethlehem. But we haven't got any indicators in external writings, like visitors, early church fathers, who came and marked a spot before Helena did, 300 years after the crucifixion. The Annunciation Church, exactly the same story. The churches in Encarum, now here there's a bit of a dilemma with the churches in Encarum, okay, because the Church of the Visitation, we have no early tradition before the Byzantines. But the Church of St. John Baharim, St. John the Baptist Church, we do have an indicator there from the 2nd century, and that is that Hadrian built a pagan temple on that spot, in a very illogical spot. So that would have been, knowing his policies, that would have been to obliterate any other site, any other importance of the site to worshippers of other faiths other than the Roman faith. So it's extremely possible. We can say, actually, I shouldn't really include both of those churches there, because just like the Holy Sepulchre, it has that 2nd century tradition of knowing there was a temple built there to obliterate the site of Christian worship, the same in Encarum in the lower church. In the upper church, it shouldn't really be here. The upper church should be in a seaside. Rachel's tomb, very, very early tradition. We read about writers going right back to the very early centuries of visiting Rachel's tomb. But we don't know if that Mameluke cenotaph that's been built there with the dome over the top is really the original one. But we're pretty sure, because of an early tradition, the same with the Joseph tomb, the same with the beaches in Tabcha, the same with Bethphage, the same with Bethany. We know roughly where these are, you know, within 50, 100 yards. They can't be that far out. But the absolutely categorical, the site, no, we don't know that. Examples of B sites. This is the guess. Oh, I've got that wrong. This, my annotation here is wrong. That is the church in Encarum. Okay, the earliest tradition we've got there is, so actually I shouldn't be using this. I intended to use the Gethsemane church because this is we don't have anything before the 390s in the Visitation Church. This is the Church of the Nativity, as you know it. This is the beach at Tabcha, not recent, as you can see, because there's no rain here. All of this is underwater now. And of course, the Holy Sepulchre. So those are B sites. We know roughly around here, yes, this precise spot, this precise place where one church or another put a marker. No, not authentic to that degree, How to view the biblical sites again? The C sites. Now, C sites are the classics. Sites with a late tradition only. Sometimes a very late tradition, and sometimes having no match whatsoever to the biblical description, or the archaeology, or the topography, or the culture of the biblical period that they're supposed to relate to. They were usually only created out of a need to mark and to remember. Examples of this are the Cana wedding church. Yes, we've got an inscription, which is by the virtue of the fact that it's an Aramaic inscription in the Hebrew language, we know it's after the 2nd century, because every inscription from the 2nd century AD, the 1st century AD, the 1st century BC, and the 2nd century BC in the Galilee is in Hebrew, not Aramaic, because the Hasmoneans made the Hebrew language part of their national identity in keeping themselves free of Hellenism and free of influences of the East. So that's a late tradition. That's a late synagogue. And do we know that that was the same synagogue that was there 200, 300 years earlier when Jesus was in Cana, when Nathaniel beat Bartholomew lived in Cana? We don't know that. There's another site called Tel Cana. Maybe that's the site. Corsi. Couldn't be more wrong, the situation, but it's convenient. It's a necessity. If you want to have a place to commemorate, people have got to be able to access it. So Corsi was on a major route. The Beatitudes. Who decided that the Sermon on the Mount was at the Mount of Beatitudes? Well, nobody did. But in 1923, when the Vatican buys that property and names it the Mount of Beatitudes and builds a chapel on it, There is no tradition before 1923. We don't know where the Beatitudes were. We don't know where the Sermon on the Mount took place. These are sea sites. Transfiguration on Mount Tabor, again, 380, the first church, 350 years later. Did anyone mark that beforehand? Did any church father talk about a tradition coming down that the Gospels mentioned that specifically that it's on Mount Tabor? No. So it's a sea site. Mount Precipice, beautiful place, fantastic site. I recommend taking all the evangelicals there, but not to do with the story of Jesus being pushed over something, because you wouldn't march him half a kilometer or nearly a kilometer up the furthest hill to the highest place to throw somebody off. That's not what a stoning is. In the second temple era, a stoning was not that. Stoning was you push someone from double the height of a man, no more than that, not 500 meters. 4 meter height at the very, very most. And if they survive that, and most did, you can then throw stones on them, and most survived that as well. Paul, the apostle, was stoned 3 times, survived each time. It's not a death sentence. But the Mount Precipice, nonsense. So far out of the village of Nazareth, nonsense story. But we can go to Mount Precipice and we can see the whole book of Judges in front of our eyes. That interests the evangelicals, yes. The Muhraka. Who decided that the site of Elijah and the miracle with Elijah and the prophets of Baal took place at the Muhraka? Well, the Carmelites did. Does it make sense? Absolutely not. Because when you're on the top of a mountain, the Bible tells us categorically that after the event, Elijah sent his servant to go to the top of the mountain to look out to the Mediterranean to see if there's a cloud coming, if God's promise of bringing back the rain is going to happen. You can't send your servant to the top of the mountain if you're already standing on the top of the mountain. And why would Elijah ask Ahab to make all the tribes climb a mountain? It's much more sensible that this story took place way down below, close to the Kishon, maybe at one of the abandoned tells like Tel Kashish. So the Muhraka is also a nonsense place. The Bethlehem milk grotto, very, very late tradition. No proof that that took place. It's just a story. Qasr al-Yahud. If you could, if it wasn't like an international border, if you could you walk across the Jordan at Qasr al-Yahud? The answer is no. You would sink in the mud to your neck. The only place you can cross a river is at what we call in Hebrew a ma'abara. And that is at the end of a wadi, just like where Wadi Kelp pours into the Jordan. The exact meeting point is full of river stones that are boulders that have rolled over, and they've formed a basis on top of the mud in the river, just like at the Adam Bridge. These are natural crossing places where people can walk on stones on solid ground, and you can even pull a wagon to an extent to get across. Animals can cross, not in a mud trench. So Qasr al-Yahud is an invention. Why? Because at some point, people used to cross there, used to swim across there. Why there? Why did the Byzantines make the big thing there? Because they had to commemorate it. St. Peter in Gallicantu. Do we have anything whatsoever to tie us to the high priest in that particular building? Zero. We have 2 or 3 mikvaot, ritual immersion baths, within a compound. But they're all the same all over Jerusalem, and everywhere that's been dug up in Jerusalem from the Second Temple era. What about expensive, highly expensive stone jars, stone vessels, because the priest could eat off stone because stone could not become tameh, tainted, unclean. If they had to serve in the temple, they had to keep everything pure. Nothing. What archaeological finds do we have there? Nothing, apart from a mosaic from the 5th century or the 6th century even. How about proximity to the area of the Maccabean king. Because if you recall, the Maccabean kings were high priest and king and had their own palace. Nowhere near it. It's down in the lower city. What about the Via Dolorosa? The Via Dolorosa that we know today was invented in the 10th, in the 11th century. Officially made up and laid out in the 12th century. Nothing about it is authentic except for the area around the church itself. The Last Supper room is Crusader. David's tomb is Mameluke. And the Garden tomb has nothing to do with the Second Temple era. Every archaeologist that's ever looked at it have said this is a First Temple era tomb, classic chamber tomb with tall ceilings, no slots, recycled, secondary use during the Byzantine era. So these are sea sites, but there is value in some of them. Okay, so Peter and Gallicantu, I've discussed that. Corsi, let me discuss Corsi, I didn't explain it. You'll all know where this is in Corsi. Over here is the hill. On the edge of this hill, you've got the remains of a part of the monastery. What does it say in the Bible? It says the pigs ran down the hill straight into the sea. What would they have to do at Corsi? They'd have to run down the hill, do a 400-meter sprint, and then drown in the shallowest part of the whole Kinneret. It makes no sense. The Last Supper room, really? Part of a medieval Catholic cathedral? The site even doesn't make any sense. Why would someone who isn't from the city and is staying on the Mount of Olives go to the far west of the city to find a room for rent? Mukhraka. I love the chapel when I'm there with Catholics. It's great. It's made of 12 uncut stones. You've got all the quotes in Hebrew and Arabic from the passages in the Bible. It's a great place. Just not authentic. Garden tomb, similarly. I think I've discussed that. Okay. So, D4 sites. Sites that inspire evangelicals. Some suggested sites which evangelicals love to visit and to read scripture at. Ancient Shiloh, the site of the tabernacle and the Shekhinah, and every evangelical knows what Shekhinah is, for 369 years. They know what it means. It means the dwelling place of the divine presence. They've read the book of Chronicles. They've read the book of Kings. They know what this is. Tel Bet Shemesh, the story of the Ark of the Covenant's return from the Philistines, which in a way is a miracle, the way these milk cows didn't try and run after their calves, but they went straight down the valley, not going left and not going right, and they were sacrificed by the people when they came there. So that is a place that is authentic. You can see the road to Ekron where they came from, the same valley, the same event, and you can even take them down into the cisterns where there are remnants left in plaster in terms of dating of the plaster from the time of at least of Solomon. Tel Azekah, or the South Gate of Sha'araim, to describe the David and Goliath story that everybody on earth, or most people on earth know. It's the widest known story in the world, is David and Goliath, even in cultures that aren't distinctly related to the Abrahamic faiths. Okay, it's just a well-known story. So you take these people there and you read the story of David and Goliath, even reading before that in the contact that David had with Saul, giving background, and you do that from a point where you can see this whole valley laid out in front of you. It's the best experience of reading that story that these people could ever get. It comes to life for them. The Nukaib Lookout. Nukaib Lookout is the only cliff on the eastern Kinneret. The only cliff, there's no other cliff. Oh yeah, Ma'atz, the Public Works Department, carved a road through it in 1970. That's true, but the cliff is still there. And the swine and the demoniac and the feeding of 4,000, that spot is less than 1 kilometer from Hippos, the Decapolis, When Jesus says to him, go to your people, and you can't come with me, go to your people and tell them what God has done for you. The man goes there. He goes to the Decapolis, that's where he's from. So it would be Hippos. It could be Gadara, which is today next to Kis in Jordan in the northern Gilead, but they're very close from where he is. And he tells them, he basically goes to preach the gospel. How do you think 4,000 Gentiles show up when Jesus comes back there 18 months later into his ministry? How do they even come together? Nobody thinks about that. At that spot, you can make these evangelicals think about that. They love that. Also, the symbolism in feeding the 4,000 and the baskets that are left over, and then effectively bashing the disciples on the head because they don't understand that it's not about bread. That's in the beginning of Matthew 16. Tel Kinnerot. Everyone knows where Tel Kinnerot is. It's the hill under which the turbines are that you got dragged to on the tour guide course to see where they pump the water from the Kinneret. Well, they no longer do. And there's pretty much nothing in the national water carrier these days because the desalinated water makes up most of our drinking water. But you get to the top of that hill, it's a very logical place. Why? Because in that, we have to understand, and they will understand, that a teacher in the first century, a Jewish teacher, is not a Greek. He's not going to talk to them about Mount Olympus. He's not going to lecture them about Athens, about Alexandria, or about Philadelphia, which later gets its Semitic name back in Amman, Rabat Ammon. He's not going to do this because they can't see it, or they can't smell what it is he's talking about, or they can't touch what it is he's talking about. Jewish teachers taught an earthy form of teaching. It's what you're right there among. So if he says a city on a hill can't be hidden, he's not just being a fancy Greek philosopher. He's saying that because people at that moment can see a city on a hill. And the only city on a hill around the Kinneret is Gamla, that they would know, because this is teaching Jews. Yes, they would know Hippos, but where are you going to take them that they could see Hippos? To the top of the Arbel? Really? You make people climb a mountain? Now, where are you going to get a crowd up there for? The crowd is on the Via Maris. The crowd is on the international highway. So it has to be very, very close to the international highway. So yes, the Mount of Beatitudes is a good candidate. Tel Kinnerot was abandoned at the time of Alexander the Great. It's also a place they could have gone up. It's 50 yards from 50 meters, less, 25 meters from the Via Maris. You can climb up from the sea to that hilltop without any real effort. So it's as good a spot as any. They like to go where they're not being taken to a Catholic church, so that's a good site to take them to. And to read the Sermon on the Mount, whether you read it from Luke's condensed version or from Matthew. Nahal Parat Outlook, the Wadi Kilt Outlook. There's two spots, one in Mitzpeh Yericho and one on an open area where a few Bedouin kids will come and sell you trinkets afterwards. The other site, nobody will bother you. These are great spots for tell the Good Samaritan story, which is a parable. It didn't take place. Abraham and Lot separate somewhere in this area. You can read that. The Valley of the Shadow of Death reading about Zacchaeus unless you're entering Jericho, in which case you can deal with that down there. Well, these are great viewpoints. You can look down on the area where opposite across the Jordan from Jericho, which is where Sodom and Gomorrah were. Not Mount Sodom, that we call it Mount Sodom today. That's a modern name. En Gedi, Saul seeking out David. The same at Tel Ziph on Route 60 is where Saul sought out David in that area. At En Gedi, you've also got the story of Jehoshaphat stopping an invasion from the east. Anything like this, the places that they love to go, because places they can see the topography, they can see the geography, they can see exactly what was going on there. I think we move into another section here. I've got the second interval break, but I'm going to continue because just ignore that for the moment. We're going to do. In fact, I want to go back and cover more of these sites, and then I will go on to. I'll move into the next section because there's too much at the end of this thing. So if you're already going into ancient Shiloh, then you saw that I had a picture behind me. You know, I can just unshare this for the moment. I've got a picture behind me, and that picture is taken in Ariel at a 1-to-1 reconstruction, which was mainly donated by evangelical Christians. Not just the Ark of the Covenant, not just the tabernacle, but the whole compound around it, with the stakes going all the way around it at the exact distance in cubits that is described in the book of Exodus. The pillars at the front, the materials used in it, the incense table, the altar, everything is precisely as described when it's commanded to create it in the book of Exodus. It is totally authentic in its reconstruction. Obviously, no, you know, there's not real gold on the duplicate of the ark and the incense altar and the candelabra, but everything else is. And when you want to read about things in the book of Exodus and what that meant, and throughout the book of Numbers, when you talk about them collapsing and rebuilding every 2 years for 40 years, 20 times they collapse and rebuild the tabernacle, you come here and you see what a temporary structure looks like that you can collapse and carry with you. If you show them that, which is in the compound of the hotel called Eshel HaShamron on the edge of Ariel, and from there you take them to Shiloh, then they're connecting a visual to a spot where the whole thing could have sat. I have had, having done that, I've had especially with Pentecostals, but not just Pentecostals, some general evangelicals. I've done this with them, breaking it up, by the way, in the middle. In between, I've gone to Mount Kabir and to Mount Gerizim for the views, and we've done all sorts of other stuff there. We talked about Jesus and the Samaritan woman at the well. And then we go to Shiloh, and they take this picture that's behind me and they put it in their mind to where that site may have been, and the archaeological indicators that it may have been there, with the exact width in cubits, with the wall around the hills around it, the remains from 1400, 1500, 1300, 1200 BC, the pottery that shows that they built a wall saying beyond this point, Shiloh b'chol hanireh, everywhere you can see from Shiloh. In other words, you're allowed to eat your sacrifice once you've given it to the priest and you've got your meat back. You're allowed to eat it on special plates. These are holy plates. This was the meat that had been dedicated to God. You ate it and then you had to destroy it. You couldn't use it for just, you know, having your ice cream on later or whatever it is you're going to eat. It became an important vessel because your offering had been given on it. So you smashed it. It was one off. And these huge piles of ceramics all around the hills around it, behind a little wall, beyond which you couldn't see where the altar was. So you take these people and describe this to them. And I have had people simply tell me when I'm there at the site that we believe is the site of the tabernacle, Adrian, just stop, give us a break, we need time. They are so spiritually, emotionally moved by being at that spot that you can't speak to them. You've got to give them 15 to 20 minutes to get their senses back. They are physically and emotionally moved by being at that spot because they know that the Shekhinah was there for 369 years. And some of the Pentecostals will tell you, I can still feel it. That is a place to blow their mind. If you can get, if you can get some way to get into Shechem with whatever necessary things are necessary. And I have actually been to see the Orthodox Church in Shechem with an evangelical group, but we didn't go to the Tel Balata. If you can get them there and you can talk about what goes on between Jacob and Hamor, right there next to the Tel. It was a Bronze Age city at the time. This is like mind-bending for these people because they know these passages so well. And to be standing where this took place is like, whoa, it's the big wow moment. Similarly, at Tel Rumeida in Hebron, you can see an area at the back that the National Parks Authority is now in charge of 2 days a week, Thursdays and Fridays. I was there on a Hishtalmut last week. Sorry, the week before last. You see 3 walls. One wall of distinctly simply put together large uncut stones, no situts, no carving of the stone, because it's from Bronze Age, early bronze to middle bronze. And then you've got an extension of that wall where it's built like wider and a little bit further outside it with distinctly cut stones to make a smooth edge to it, and towers are sticking out. That is from the Iron Age. And then you've got a massive wall. I mean, if you take the broad wall in Jerusalem that relates to Hezekiah, the same period, the same timing, the same dating of the wall by ceramics, and the same of the wall in Hebron, that bit that's showing is double that thickness. So you can take a group there and you can say, this wall is from the time of Abraham. It was here when Abraham came and had his negotiations with Ephron. And this wall here is here from the time of David and Solomon. And this wall here is from the time of Hezekiah. It's a wow factor. You then can take them around the other side and you can see the actual street, the remains of the actual street. There was an unpleasant terror incident that took place there, as a result of which a house was damaged, and then what happened was basically there was a donation of money was raised to rebuild a whole community house where this rabbi was murdered in his studio. And before they did that, when they put the foundations in, they went to excavate, and wow, what do they find? They find the street dating back 4,000 years, dating back to the time before Abraham, of the city of Hebron, where it starts to take on steps, and then it all disappears because it's later construction. You're talking about the steps of the city, the gates to the city of Hebron, the exact spot, because cities, as we know in the Bronze Age, only had one gate. The exact spot where Abraham would have negotiated in front of the elders with Ephron to buy the field, the cave of Machpelah, which is a couple of hundred yards behind you. This is mind-bending stuff for evangelicals. Abraham's first piece of real estate. Shechem, Jacob's first piece of real estate. Yes, he inherited his grandfather's land in Hebron, but that's his first piece of real estate in what was the most significant city, of course, throughout the whole Bronze Age and well into the Iron Age, in Samaria, in Shechem. These are amazing things to take people to. To take them to Beersheba, to Tel Sheva, is another thing that would be. I mean, Beersheba is mentioned so many times. You could do your readings from there, everything to do with it. It doesn't matter which of the patriarchs it is. It's mainly Abraham, yeah. To take people to Lachish, to talk about everything that took place from the archaeology that we know in Lachish, from the inscriptions of Lachish that the French archaeologists found in Nineveh and are today in the Louvre in Paris. They may not have seen that, but to describe that story of Lachish, to read about what went on with when Sennacherib conquered the city, to read about Lachish in earlier times, to go to Gath of the Philistines, or to be near it, and to then tour that area or see it from a high up place and describe the area that was under the control of the king of Gath. Gath, Haplishti, Tel Safi. You then can discuss all the things that went on when David ran away from Saul from that spot. When he goes to Achish, the king of Gath, and I don't know, he probably thinks, what's this rebel doing working for me? You know, do I really trust him? You know what? I'm going to appoint him as in charge of one of my garrison towns. So he sends him to Ziklag. And when he gets to Ziklag, it's been raided by desert raiders, Amalekites. And off he goes, and he gets everything back again. Taken from his people and taken from the rest of the people. Ziklag. You can virtually from Gat, you can almost see these places, and you can go to them now. We know pretty much now, one of the better places identified as Tel Ziklag. And you can imagine the geopolitics, which is jumping out of the biblical pages, and you can read them there, and people are connecting to their Bible. That's what they want. They don't want rituals. They don't want to hear about, well, we'll get into it. They don't want to hear about Chutmas. They don't want to hear about Dahar el-Omar. It doesn't interest them. They don't care about Helena. And they don't want to know anything about the Crusaders. Zero. Doesn't interest them. Okay. 11:05. We've still got time to go. We've still got plenty of time to go on this. I'm going to go to the next section. Okay. That's great. Okay, I'm going to go into this next section to make the last one less busy. Okay, I'm going to stop for a minute before I start this next section and answer some of the questions. Going back to 2012, they use the word crusade instead of pilgrimage. I've not heard people talk about crusade. A crusade is something to change. It's like a military campaign almost, or a propaganda campaign, a crusade against something in English. I've never heard anyone use it as a crusade instead of a pilgrimage. Don't you see this as a specific term is offensive to most Christians? Anton, I don't really understand that question. Who's they? Use the word crusade instead of pilgrimage. Evangelicals, I've never heard them use crusade. On the contrary, they see the crusaders.
I can talk, yes?
Yeah.
I had several groups, evangelicals, and used the term, Pastor, when are going to launch a crusade? So it was used by several groups that I had myself.
Launch a crusade against what?
No, it's like a pilgrimage, but they say it's a crusade, you know, or launching a crusade to the Holy Land. They use the term crusade. That's what I meant.
Okay.
I don't know why.
Interesting. I've never heard that. I've heard them saying we're going on a crusade against drug abuse. We're going on a crusade against sexual immorality. I've heard them say going on a crusade against something that they think is wrong, but I've not heard them actually use that. That's interesting. So I don't really know that. And 800 years ago, George Bush used it and created more hatred among other faiths, leading to vandalism and the burning of churches. Possibly. I mean, I know that you can say that, or it could be various reasons why the churches were burned in Egypt, for example.
Yeah, when the Twin Towers fell, you know, he used the term. That's what I'm asking.
Oh, he did. We're going on a crusade against the terrorists. Yeah, it's a word that's in Western culture. Well, I had my high school education in Britain. I was taught the Crusaders were heroes. You know, I didn't learn about them burning people alive in Jerusalem, about the massive pogroms and slaughters of Jews as they went along the Rhine and down into the Danube and met in Asia. I didn't learn about Jewish communities being burned alive, coming through Antioch south, going south. These were the heroes. They were liberating the Holy Land from the Muslim oppressors. That's the way I was taught in school. You come here, we go on the tour guides course, and you learn a bit of history and realize it's not quite the way they presented it there. So for me, that concept of a crusade is basically we're going to change things with a religious viewpoint. Okay. All right. Grouper, David. David's tomb is very dubious. Mamlukite also, but evangelical groups still like. No, evangelicals don't like visiting it. They're dragged there because the program says David's tomb. They don't like to go there. They don't believe for a second that it's David's tomb. And any tour guide who tells them is doing them a great disservice. And if they find out that you're lying to them, you will be finished. You will never work with them again. That group, not any group, you get other groups, but you'll never work with that group again because you fed them stories that are not true and they hate that. So David's tomb is not somewhere they like to go. It's somewhere agents put in the program that you have to drag them to. I have got to say that, thank God, it has been 4.5, nearly 4. We didn't work the last year, but it's been 5 years since I was made by an agent to take any evangelical group to anywhere on Mount Zion. It's all false sites. I don't go anywhere near it, not Gallicantu. I take them to the Herodian Quarter. I don't go to David's tomb, and I don't go to the Last Supper room, because I talk about that when I'm the Southern Steps and point out the area where the UN buildings are, or in the model in Jerusalem, in the Hebrew University, in the Israel Museum. I point out to the cluster of small buildings which are below the Hulda gates, but above the palace of the Abilene palaces. This is where these things took place. And there are indicators in the book of Acts that that's where it took place. So I know I have some very stubborn agents who tell me what to do, and I have to do this and I have to do that. But they know I'm a fanatical authenticist, so I get away with it. Some people, actually, I can't get away with it. I've got to do exactly what they say, and it's very frustrating. And when I'm with Catholic groups, I don't tell them this is the spot. I say, this is where we commemorate. And one of the best things is I work with there's one priest I work with every year. He's a great guy from Philadelphia. And as we start doing the Via Dolorosa, always, one of the ladies in the group will run up to us, because he's leading it. I'm just on the side. He's doing the praying the stations and everything. And we'll come up to him and say, Father, is this where Jesus really walked? And he'll roll his eyes and look at me like another one that thinks, no, dear, this is not. But this is where we commemorate it. That is legitimate in all the Roman churches. To commemorate something, it doesn't have to be the precise spot, because you're commemorating it. And that's the purpose of your pilgrimage, is to go from spot to spot and connect in the way you do through praying in those spots. That's fulfilling the tenets of a pilgrimage. You go to Lourdes for the same reason. You go to Santiago de Compostela for the same reason. Evangelicals, that's not their thing. They don't relate to it, and they certainly don't want it. Can we connect the Herodian Quarter with the house of Caiaphas? Without a shadow of a doubt. We can't say that is Caiaphas's house, because we haven't found an inscription there, the same as we have in the Kypros house. In the Kypros house, we found a description with jars which named the family name from the late 2nd century, and we know that they are mentioned. Both the family of Caiaphas, Kepha, and the family of Kypros are mentioned in the Talmud, which it was written down in the Galilee 350 years later, but it includes references from the Mishnah, which are traditions from that time, and it says, "Woe to you, Beit Kapros! Woe to you, Beit Kepha!" In other words, they're saying, because the corruption of these priests that they believe caused the downfall of the Second Temple, and you can see the abject wealth there. So if this was the high priest's house, it was certainly among the wealthiest priestly houses in Jerusalem, and it had to be priestly because of so many stone vessels, not ceramics, only the highest level of imported ceramics from Cyprus and from Greece, but mainly stone vessels. A mikvah in every single living room, not just in every house, in every single living room. In other words, you live as a family unit, as a bet av, a father's house, an insula in Latin, and each family unit of the nuclear family of the son and his wife and their children is in their little section, and they all come together and eat their weekly meal together in the family complex. You see that even in the Byzantine era, it continues. You see it in Chorazin. You can see remains of it in Capernaum from the very early centuries. You can see it in Katrin. They like to go to Katrin as well, even though it's mainly Byzantine, but they see the structure of the houses, the way these houses were laid out 3-4 centuries earlier. Sorry, I've lost my track a little bit. I was talking about the Herodian Quarter. So you see that, you see a palatial reception area. Now, what regular wealthy priest from an aristocratic priestly family in Jerusalem would have a reception room decorated with stucco, fresco, and mosaic, even better than has been found in Herod's palaces, if not the high priest's house. So again, we can't say that is his house. This is Abed's question. We can't say that is the house, but we can say, if this is not it, this is at least what it looked like. And I'll take you one step further, and we do this on the course. But if you go into the courtyard next to that reception area, where there are cisterns and even a mikveh underground, and it would have been exposed to the ceiling, to the sky, and it's March at night in Jerusalem, it's going to be cold, it's going to be like 9-10 degrees. You can imagine Peter sitting by a fire. And the first room that separates that courtyard from the reception hall is a servant's room, like a cooking or a larder or something. So the servant girl's coming out, speaking to Peter, saying, do you know this guy in there? You can make that whole thing come to life in that spot. You can't in any aspect of Peter in Gallicantu. Oh, you can go down to the pit and read Psalm 88, sure. Was that a prison pit? Was it not just a cistern dug in the 5th century or the 6th century, but when the Byzantine church built on the spot simply converted the mikvah, took away the bottom 4 steps and converted it into a cistern? You don't know. But here you do know, with the alabaster and the glass from Enion of Sidon and all the other aspects of that make that place so special in the Herodian quarter and the discoveries there. You know that is from the wealthiest priests in Jerusalem. You know that when they're talking about chief priests and elders, this is the home, or one of them. So absolutely, you can connect with that. Yes, I will send it to Arya. You can have the matzeget. Not an editable version, but that version of the presentation that I produced. How can we? Abed, tell me what you mean there. How can we? Abed the Suki. Can't see you. Are they? No, hang on. Need to find the name. Oh, here you are. I see you. I see you. I see you. What did you mean by how can we? You can tell me what you mean. Tell me what you mean. I forgot to add how. Okay, sorry. Okay, I got it. Okay, thank you, Paul. Okay, let's. I'm going to finish this session around 12. We've got 3/4 of an hour. I'm going to go a little bit into the next section. Okay, we're going to go back to screen share. Okay. This is from here on, it's basically to do with what is for the tour guide. What can you contribute to their overall tour and what to expect from the pastor. So evangelicals, how can you deliver on the goods as a tour guide? Evangelicals have a hunger to learn more about the biblical characters and the biblical land, not from a doctrinal view. Simply truths. If you grow up in Caracas in Venezuela, in, I don't know, Sao Paulo in Brazil, in Kentucky, then your reality is defined by where you live and by the hills that you know. When you see biblical hills mentioned, you imagine the hills that you know. When you see plains mentioned, you imagine the plains that you know. When you imagine how people lived, dressed, and everything else 2,000, 3,000 years ago, you don't have any concept. Because in most of these places, there was virtually nothing 3,000 years ago. So connecting to that, making these people and the way they lived come alive helps them understand so much more about the text. So how did Jesus grow up? These are questions you'll hear. How did Jesus grow up? What did he eat? What would he have worn? If you can see this, but I've got Kaspersky popping up. How did he get to go on his journeys? How do you make a journey? How do you fund it? How do you finance it? What do you take with you? What do you need to take with you? Which routes did he take? What was the source of his biblical knowledge? You need to talk about the education system in late Second Temple Judea and Galilee. The education system was controlled by the Pharisees, the teachers who taught these kids their Bibles, certainly the Torah, off by heart. In the Bet Sefer, and in Magdala, you see a Bet Sefer. You even see the table on which they held open the scrolls. Not that fancy table, the other one that a few people talk about, with the two slots to hold it from rolling on the floor. They then went, after that, they started to learn the book of the prophets. And finally, they start to learn about the oral law. And we laugh about the oral law. You know, many evangelical groups say, oh no, oral law, we don't believe any of that. You don't believe any of that? Very interesting, because Jesus observed a lot of it. Teaching in synagogues, preaching in synagogues, does that appear in the Bible? No, that's oral law. How about being for the dedication festival in Jerusalem, Hanukkah? That's not in the Bible. That's oral law. Jesus did it. What about the fringes, the tzitzit? Yeah, it's in the written law. How does it actually do it practically? What about having disciples? What about the concept of someone being a rabbi, greater than me? Is any of this in the Bible? When I say the Bible, I mean the Hebrew Bible that Jesus knew. Zip, nothing. It's all oral law, and Jesus is observing it. How did he know the Greek expressions? What did he do between the ages of 12 and 30, which is absent from Luke's gospel? Well, if you want, you can go to the book published in the 2nd century called the Proto-Gospel of James, or it would be the Proto-Evangelion of Jacob. And in that, you've got all the stories. You've got about Anna and Joachim. You've got about the story of how John the Baptist and Elizabeth hid in a rock by an angel. You've got all this stuff. All of this is in that book, published 120 years after the crucifixion, approximately 120 to 130 years after the crucifixion. Most of the early Catholic traditions that are not biblical come from that book. That's a source if you want. If you don't take that as a source, then you've got to look into the culture of his day to understand what he did between the age of 12 and 30. We'll go into further detail with that in the continuation of this. Where did his teaching with parables come from? Where did he get to do this? How did he start teaching in parables? Was he the only one in history to do that? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. It was standard practice for every Pharisee to teach with parables. And all of that is only just to do with Jesus. What about the prophets and the kings? They come with so many questions. What route did King Josiah of Judea take to meet Pharaoh Necho at Megiddo? Evangelicals are very big on Josiah because they see him as a great reformer, as one of the few kings of Judah who wasn't a baddie in the Bible. They know a lot about him. They know a lot about Hezekiah, the big reformers, the abolishers of idolatry. So they know that what happened to him at Megiddo, but no, what route did he take? Where was the Battle of Ebenezer? Can we go near it? Can we see where this took place? Can you explain why it was there? It's near Afek. It's near the sources of the Jayalcom because they had to go past there. And it's down ravines that lead down from the area of Shiloh. What was David's route to En Gedi? Nachal Tekoa, probably. Charitun, as the continuation of it is called. Where in the Kidron exactly did David flee in sackcloth and ashes from Absalom? Was it in Gethsemane? No, it wasn't. That wasn't part of Jerusalem. Which part? You can tell them these things. They want to know where. Which route did Paul take to Damascus? That's a great one, because some evangelical groups like to go to Kalat Namrud. Why? Because they believe that's where Paul went past. I mean, come on. Paul is in Jerusalem when this happens. You've got to go to Damascus. What was the right route from Jerusalem to Damascus? You go down to Jericho, you cross the Jordan, you go up the other side onto the king's route and off to Damascus. You avoid the whole Yarmukh gorge, But others think, oh no, he went all the way through to Galilee first, and then he went from Galilee to the Hula, and then he went through past Tel Dan, and then he climbed up that monstrous hill all the way to Khalat Namrud, and they like to go to Khalat Namrud and talk about the revelation to Paul and the Hidden. I mean, I'm not saying that there aren't some crazy people out there. I'm saying that this is because of their lack of knowledge of the culture, the climate, the customs of the days of Paul, of the days of Jesus, of the days of the prophets. They're not familiar with them. And not being familiar with them leads them into speculations. And the role that you can have, the valuable role you can have as a guide, is to enlighten them on things that we know as facts from that period, so that they can then look at the Bible and say, oh, wow, let me think. Oh, yeah, that makes so much more sense. Now I can understand why he did this and why he said that. So these are just examples of unasked questions. But if you can provide those answers before being asked, or even after being asked, but if you do this before, if you preempt it, to say in English, in your guiding, it's the most valuable role of the tour guide with evangelicals, because you are giving them what they want without them even asking for it. You need to connect them to the landscape and the scripture combined together as much as you possibly can, and point out the verses. Point out the verses. So, aims and hopes of evangelical visitors and the tour guide. Evangelical visitors are desperate to return home with a deeper, wider understanding of who exactly was the historical Jesus. They seek enrichment. I'm talking about the historical Jesus, not the spiritual Jesus, not the conceptual Jesus. Son of God, only Son, all the rest of that. We're not talking about that. Who was he as the man? What shaped him as the man? In order to help them achieve this as a tour guide, you have to give them context, historical context, cultural context, topographical and political context of the land of Israel in each biblical era, but especially towards the end of the Second Temple era. They do not need to hear from you what they already learned at home. They came here to learn something new. They did not come here to learn about Thutmoses III or Byzantines or Ottomans or Mamelukes or Crusaders, or who was the first to excavate in Megiddo and who was the second one. It is not biblical. Tell them about the plants and the trees and the animals. Great. But if you do so, give them the biblical verses which mention each of these things. This too can help them connect to the land. Their journey here is to better understand their Bibles and the promised land through a spiritual journey here into the text. Literally a spiritual journey into the text, lived as they walk through the land. And all of that helps them feel closer to God, that they understand him better. How could the pastor and the group seem to the guide? What might your impressions might be? This is pretty important. Most evangelical pastors have very good leadership skills. They know how to lead their community, as well as having excellent preaching or evangelist skills. However, very, very few have an academic background in the scriptures. What does that mean? It means that, as I mentioned earlier, to be a pastor, you simply have to be good at speaking to people, good at extrapolating, taking things out of the Bible and giving a teaching on it. And that's recognized usually at quite a in a youngish age within a community. And they'll say to the current pastor, they'll say, this guy, he could be, let him be our youth pastor. He can really speak to the kids. He can do great. Let's try him. And he becomes a youth pastor, dealing with the youth services and the youth, the youth meetings and the Sunday school and so on. overlooked by another pastor. They don't necessarily need any formal training. And if they don't, even if they do go to seminaries, they generally, they went to college, they got the first degree, they do a second degree called a Master of Divinity. And they do that, and they then study the scriptures and the early church and the writings of the early church fathers. They study all of that. But it's only if they go to one or two very special universities, seminaries. One is, I say very special, I'll explain what I mean in a minute. Very, very few, where they learn about the intertestamental period in great detail from external writings to the Bible, where they learn about the period of Jesus and his life from external sources drawn, whether they're Jewish or Greek sources, to explain about life at that time. And it's very, very rare that people have this. Majority of this other people going to seminaries, they're learning established doctrines within the evangelical church, views, viewpoints, especially if it's a Baptist sort of. Every year, normally every year, I'm working with the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, and they are interesting people. They can be between 25 years old and 45, 50 years old. But they've decided they need an academic background to being a pastor, so they go and study. It's not common. There are evangelical spiritual leaders who have little or no knowledge at all about the Seleucid or the Roman empires, apart from Hollywood, or ancient extra-biblical manuscripts. Manuscripts existing from the same period as the New Testament period, or even the intertestamental period, many manuscripts existing, which explain more about that era, from the historical eras leading up to the New Testament, or about the dynamics. This is really important. They know nothing about the dynamics of late Second Temple Judean society, beyond what they can take or glean from the New Testament. These are fields in which the tour guide can provide serious enrichment. Give you an example. If you take them to Nebi Samuel and you take them through that Hasmonean era village that was built there, they are walking through a village which is just like any village was in Judea 200 years later. They're all there. Nobody destroyed between the two. Sure, there were battles between the Hasmoneans and Herod and so on, but they didn't destroy towns and cities in those battles. So things like that, you can give them so much. So this is your area as a guide. But there are some very conservative churches who actually fear exposure to these ideas, worried that something might come out that somehow contradicts the scripture or contradicts what they've always believed. There's some very conservative groups like that, and you've got to be very careful. In contrast, there are pastors who absolutely love this sort of input on biblical periods, as it enriches their biblical understanding and even deepens the faith of the people in the group, the participants. So you've got to learn and know your pastor and your group. If you're getting a group, you're getting an evangelical group, look up the name of their church online, go into their webpage, find out what they believe in, what are their principles, get to know them before they come here, and try and find the king's weight, the derech hamelech, with working with them. So what differences can a guide find between groups? Communion, the Lord's Supper. Groups vary tremendously on this. Some branches of the evangelical churches look differently on this ceremony. It can be explained by the strong desire to distance themselves from the ritual mass of the Roman churches. Within the Roman churches, the ceremony is a syncretism of Jesus' teaching, together with ancient, mostly Roman and pagan religious beliefs. So they get put off by seeing the Mass here or anywhere. And all the movements and crossing and all the things that go with that. They get put off if they see that. But some of them don't see it as important at all during a tour. Many evangelicals perform communion only privately in their home community. So they won't want to do it when they're here, not even at the garden tomb. Other groups perform the ceremony every day when on tour. You've got to find out what suits your group. Some will do this with wine, others with grape juice. Most will use any live bread, that's pita or regular bread, or they'll even use matzah. There's no sacramental wafer or anything similar. Nobody's blessing the bread. They do not bless the bread, okay? They're blessing God. It's closer to the Jewish concept than the Catholic or Orthodox concept, where you're blessing the food, or the priest is blessing the food. I've got F, G, and H. I'm going to quit here. I'm going to stop the share. And I'm going to open up this up for more questions. The only reason I've got this thing on is my wife's still asleep.
אדריאן, יש כמה שאלות בצ'אט אם אתה רוצה לבדוק.
Okay, אני אעבור על זה. Forgot how first question. How can we connect this one question? Is there any similarity between evangelicals and Mormons or Jehovah's Witnesses? Evangelicals generally believe that neither Mormons nor Jehovah's Witnesses are Christians. Mormons, because their emphasis is more on the Book of Mormon than the Bible, and I've guided Mormons, and there's whole, I mean, the stories that to any of you would be so obvious that they should know if they're Christians, but they don't. They've never read that bit of the Bible. Test them on the Book of Mormon, they know everything. It's a different thing. It's a more cultic thing. It's different. And they call themselves the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, LDS. But most evangelicals believe that they are cultic and nothing to do with Christianity. Jehovah's Witnesses, there are some things I've guided Jehovah's Witnesses. There are some things about them I really like. I like the fact that they call it the Hebrew scriptures and the Greek scriptures. They don't have that condescending Old and New Testament. You know, how many times in the Old Testament does it say, "This shall be an everlasting covenant"? This will be with me an everlasting covenant. Probably a dozen times. Well, everlasting covenant doesn't mean that the New Testament makes it not relevant anymore. I mean, that's the belief of most Protestant churches. So I like that about them. Another thing that is very comfortable with Jews for them is they do not believe in the Trinity. They don't believe that. They believe that Jesus was Messiah. They do not believe he is God in human form. And all that comes from a single verse in John. Nothing else. One single verse in John. Doesn't appear in any of the synoptics. John was published 80 years after the events. The synoptics that were published immediately after and passed down, obviously verbally, before they were written down around the year 35, 40, and then through 50 and so on. That's the only thing. They don't accept that. If you've read, remember when we were learning about the Council of Nicaea, and we heard about what was called the Arian heresy. The Arian beliefs were declared to be a heresy at the Council of Nicaea. They were persecuted, put to death even. Their beliefs were identical to the Jehovah's Witnesses. Jesus is Messiah. He is not God. No one is God except what they call Jehovah. You know, do we know how to pronounce that word? No, we don't. Shouldn't we challenge their views that will broaden the horizon and understanding to differences in diversity? Peter, I'd like you to explain that, because in what direction do you mean to challenge or to expand their views?
I mean, you see, again, they are coming to see different locations, different places, different churches. See, it cannot be only their way or the
They're not coming to see the church. Sorry,
I know,
they're not coming to see the church.
Okay, but you see, there are also other forms of Christianity.
Yes, of course.
And so they need to see that, and they need to accept that as well.
They don't need to see that or accept it. They've got that at home as well. They don't need that when they come to this country. They're coming to this country for an experience that fulfills their understanding of what a journey to the Holy Land is. They do not need to see churches and statues and icons.
I know, but it's not only that. There's one time I had this multi group of various denominations in a seminary, all right? And so I asked her a question. Do you believe that Jesus Christ is your Lord and Savior? Right? Then yes. And then one of them said, on what base? because he could not accept that the Catholic who was sitting in the bus with him was a Christian. And so that was a big debate. And so here's what I'm saying. We need to challenge the scope of understanding to also the scriptures, because it cannot be only their way. It cannot only be their literal perspective. There are other things, and there are other Christians that live in this world.
Okay, of course there are. And those, but that does not interest evangelicals. They're not interested in anything. As I said, there are only two things that they consider holy: the God and the Word of God. Okay, so anything that's a holy site, a holy place, a holy image, that for them is pagan. They don't want any part of it.
Yes, but the dialogue between Christians
Yes.
is important. Otherwise, we're only building walls.
Interdenominational dialogue, yes, is important. I agree with you.
And that's why I'm saying we
No,
need
I
to
agree with
challenge
you.
that perspective.
I'm not saying that. Listen, that is a completely different subject, and I agree with you.
Okay.
Of course, it's important.
Yeah.
Can I speak?
You also have to understand, I believe, that they don't come here to do that. They come here for a very specific reason. That is to bring the Bible to life. They don't come here to do that. They can do that back where they live.
Well,
they can go to the next town.
And I know they don't, because I live in the US as well, and they don't do that.
Okay.
And if
It depends
I don't
where.
do it here and help them to change
depends
their
where.
mindset.
Yeah, it depends where. I mean, you can discuss it with them, but it shouldn't be part of the program.
Okay.
You can discuss it with them. You know, bring along. I've had groups, student groups that now getting more and more mixed. We're getting Assyrians and Copts coming with these groups from the United States, student groups in the United States, because of the people that left over the last 10 years and went to the United States. And they're coming, and they're on a group which is basically designed as was supposed to be an introduction to the geopolitics of the region and a biblical journey. And basically designed for evangelicals. But now they've got more and more Catholics, Orthodox, Copts, Chaldeans, Assyrians, and all sorts coming with them, that they're having to adjust the way they are. The biggest challenge they ever had was because they used to have this big prayer get together, was to try and integrate their prayer versions together. And I was actually the first one of the guides that had a mixed bus. And it was just incredible, because one morning I had one of the faculty, one of the professors from the university who was Catholic, lead a prayer. And the evangelicals on the bus didn't know what was going on, because Catholics pray in the silences. And they were like, what's going on? Why has everyone gone quiet? It's like they couldn't get their head around it. But it was very funny, because they were learning of different ways about different people praying. So that's great. I think that's really great, bringing them together. They certainly shouldn't loathe or detest each other. It's wrong. But, you know, go and tell the people in Ireland that they've been killing each other for 800 years about it. But that's not really the purpose of their talk. It's more that they want to experience the Bible. They're not interested in all this other later traditional stuff. They can see that if they want, they can get into that at home. And if they don't want, they don't have to.
Adrian.
One of them used Kanafi with me. Yes.
אדריאן, יש עוד אנשים שמחכים גם כן לשאלות. סמיר מחכה בסבלנות.
אני אעבור לכל, אל תדאג.
בסדר, לא, אבל הם רוצים גם עם המיקרופון, לא רק עם הצ'אט.
אוקיי, אין בעיה.
אוקיי.
רגע, השאלה האחרונה פה זה,
רגע, סמיר, חכה רגע, אתה הראשון בתור.
One of them used kanafe as bread, as long as it's got wheat in it. I don't think they care. It's not important to them. I think the guide should avoid getting involved in these kinds of debates between different denominations. You don't need to get involved in it, because generally the majority of evangelical groups come with a pastor from a specific church. They've all got the same view. When you get to if you work with one of those big tele-evangelists who comes and brings 20 buses with him, then you're going to get diversity, sure, but there's still not going to be discussion. Now, this stuff you're not going to get involved in these debates. We'll talk about more this in the third section. I'll get more into what's dangerous to do, what is not worth getting involved in, and what you can do. I'll discuss that later on. So let's open the microphone to whoever wants to talk. Yalla.
Samir, אתה ראשון.
כן. You can hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, Adrian, I want just to tell you something concerning the land and the Holy the holy places, especially the
Yes.
church. Why some of those evangelists, they prefer to visit the Garden of Gethsemane and not the building? And it's all belong to the Catholic Church.
Yes.
That's one question. What does it make difference? This is in the Bible, it says a throw stone where Jesus went to pray over there.
It doesn't say a stone. There's no stone mentioned in the Bible.
To visit the building and you say that it's paganism? No. No, if all the places you mentioned, my friend, and it's not true and authentic, it's not authentic, why pilgrims are anxious to visit the land where their faith belongs to? Why? If you love a place and you hear about some place in Switzerland, beautiful, you want to go, you visit there. You want to see.
Yes.
Okay. And the second question, in your opinion, why the churches were built years after the event of Christianity? Thank you.
Okay. I would say that with the evangelical groups that I've been with that want to go, that are happy to go inside the churches and look around, are the ones that look at it purely for the architecture and the artwork and are not put off by the imagery. And it's very individual, and it comes down to the pastor and the individual church. But I would say that Baptists tend to be more open to looking at these sort of things. But they will never get down and kneel and kiss that stone in the front of the altar. That for them, stones, kissing stones, kneeling at stones, kneeling at statues, for them is paganism. You're never going to change their opinion. I'm not going to change their opinion. We have to accept that they look at it like that.
You can change their opinion, but ask them, why God asked Moses to raise the copper snake and then everybody will be healed. That's from the Old Testament, my friend.
Yes, I know. And then in 2 Kings 20, that serpent, the Nehushtan, is destroyed by Hezekiah because people had started making offerings to it. And that same symbol appears in the Greek worship as the worship of Asclepios with exactly the same symbol. And to this day, it's the symbol of the American Medical Association and other medical associations. They see that. I've been with groups that have gone to Bethesda and prayed against the influence of Asclepios.
I'm just giving you an example.
I understand the example.
In Tiberias also, where Jesus walked all the time over there. Also, they don't like to go to the church of Hara Osher up there, and they want to be outside to pray. Why?
Yes.
Only
Because
for the sake of these scripture statues and the pictures of Mary or Jesus or whatever. My friend, the Lord Jesus Christ was born here.
I'm not arguing. Samir, I think you're missing the point here. No, listen.
Let me tell you something. The Lord has the same ID like me. He has Tu'udak Hula. He is the native of this country. When he was born, died, ascended into heaven in this country. So he's the native of this country. If you go to England, to your country, and you don't have a house or whatever, you cannot prove that you are the native of England. And that's my first question. My second question, I don't know.
But you've not let me answer your first question completely.
Please.
You're describing Catholic churches or Orthodox churches. They don't want to pray in Catholic, Orthodox, or Coptic churches. They simply don't want to. They don't feel it's their home. They can't relate to the atmosphere. They don't like seeing an altar. They don't like seeing icons. They don't like seeing statues. It's against their principles of faith. So they don't want to pray there. That's their entitlement.
Which means that you're talking about the garden tomb and the Holy Sepulchre. We are asked as a tour guides many times.
סמיר ואדריאן. תראו, יש איזה כיוון לסמינר הזה, ואני מציע שלא ניכנס לדיונים תיאולוגיים ופילוסופיים, אלא באמת מה שאנשים צריכים להקשיב.
Okay, your second question. Remind me your second question.
Arya, I'm satisfied. I just asked my question. Thank you very much.
Did I answer your second question? I don't remember.
Second question was why churches were built years after the event of the Lord Jesus Christ being in this country?
The first churches that were not built as churches. They were what's called domus ecclesias, if you want to use the Latin, home church. People praying in houses. The first movement, the first church was called Hadderech, and it was an entirely Jewish movement until this last third of the first century, when after Cornelius and others, we've got Gentiles entering the movement. But it was not a constructed, there were no constructed churches. There were houses. There were people who were wealthier who became Christian, and they were open their houses to services. What I only know from the tour guide course, is that the first two churches that were ever built, specifically purpose-built as churches, were built by Helena. Okay, the facts are that it's more likely that it's Constantine that built them, not actually his mother. But it doesn't matter, it's the same thing. We're talking about the same four churches at Mamre, in Bethlehem, in Jerusalem, and on the Mount of Olives. That's what we're talking about. The fact is, this is all 300 years after the crucifixion. It's not of interest to the evangelicals. It's not of interest, they don't get themselves involved in that, because they're only interested in coming to this country to rediscover, to reconnect to
Don't you think that they were scared of the government?
Biblical era.
Do you think that they were afraid of governments like the Romans?
And of course, once they got persecuted, yes, but that's why they had home church, of course. But that, again, that would interest somebody in a seminary who's going to study the early church fathers and the early church. It does not interest the evangelical visitor.
I know that
with the Bible in their hand.
Adrian, you know that, I don't have to tell you, but you know that the Christians have 3 times in 2,000 years to build their churches with no fear. It is the Byzantine, 4th century, 12th century Crusaders.
Samir, I'm not going to get into this with you, okay? This is all post-biblical. Therefore, it's not of interest to evangelicals, period.
Okay. Anyhow, the last thing I want to say to you and to all my friends, that we have to strengthen the faith of the pilgrims. They come over here, not to suspect. Not to suspect.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Specifically, what I'm talking about on in this Yom Yun is evangelicals, because people don't understand them, or they think they're crazy. And I just want you to be, so you can get a chance to work with them to understand where they're coming from and what they're looking for and what they're not looking for.
Thank you, Arya, and thank you, Adrian. Thank you, both of you. Thanks.
Thanks. Next
Adrian,
question.
Do they consider themselves pilgrims?
No. Many of them will say to me, we are not pilgrims. This is not a pilgrimage, because for them a pilgrimage is people walking in line, holding their crosses, crossing themselves all the time and going and kissing stones and statues. That's their concept of what a pilgrimage is. Some, and I think it tends to be more the Baptists, have said to me, yeah, you can call what we're doing a pilgrimage because we're coming to the sites. We're coming to see the places that are mentioned in the Bible. That in itself is a pilgrimage. I don't think it's strictly, it's that there's a strict line, but to most evangelicals, they see a pilgrimage is what they'll see in Lourdes. It's what they'll see in what's it called? In Mexico, in
Guadalupe.
In Guadalupe,
it's because they want to distance themselves from the pagan Catholics. That's all.
It's not just that it's wrong.
I think
if they were to come, for example, at the Epiphany and go to the Jordan and to see the Orthodox rites there, the only thing they would object to is the big crosses. And for them, the cross is not that important. He was on the cross, he came off the cross, he was laid to rest, and he was resurrected. It's like history to them. It's not the issue. For them, it's more about what he had to teach and make people learn about their lives and the way they need to live their lives. So they would have less problem with that. But in Guadalupe, where where they're carrying the effigy of the Virgin on the thing, that for them is straight taken from the Roman worship of Osiris, the mother of heaven, the mother of God. That for them it's got its pagan roots. So yeah, they have different views on it. It depends. The people from South America who who converted mainly from Catholicism to become evangelicals, that doesn't offend them as much. They tend to look upon those people and think, if only they knew God personally and not through something like that. They tend to feel pity for them because they think that they have been reborn through having a personal relationship with their God. And other people feel that they've got to pray through intermediaries to get to him, and they feel sad for them. It's not that they don't think they're Christian, because they believe that they are Christians, but they're just misguided Christians. That's the way they look at it. So
if those Christians who don't share their views, are these Christians going to hell? And if these Christians who
that's
don't
theology.
Share their views,
That's theology. They don't see that.
Their mindset. If
You see, now,
doesn't share their view,
you're hitting on a very important point.
What about every non-Christian?
Okay, you're hitting on a very important point there. Let's look at this historically and not from the view of your faith or anybody else's faith, okay? From the time of the Persian Empire made a very big break in the way society and empires worked, because for the first time in history, the Persians allowed people religious autonomy. Previously to that, whatever empire conquered, it was proof that their gods had conquered your gods, and you had to adopt their religion. And this then repeats itself. It goes back again at the time of Alexander the Great, where basically the people in the cities are told, you can continue with your local gods. You're going to pay a lot of tax to Macedonia. But if you turn your city into a polis and you create a gymnasium where they're teaching the Greek philosophers, and you have an agora where they're preaching the Greek philosophers, and you have a stadium, and you have an arena, and you have a temple in the Greek style, you do all this. If you do all this, then you will get the status of a polis, and you won't pay a penny to Macedonia. You'll control your own taxation system. What are you going to do? Okay, so this was the way that the Greeks managed to impose their religion again through Alexander. So that period of the Persian Empire was very, very different. We have in the New Testament era, in the Testament of the church and Constantine especially, is using religion to reestablish his control over the empire. So he has to make uniform the religion of the empire. That's basically it. It doesn't really make any difference to the evangelicals, because their movement was not even part of the Roman Church movement. It came out of the Reformation movement. And even then, 200, 300 years after Martin Luther, and in a completely different viewpoint. So I hope that's answered the question, but basically religion is used to control people. We know that. They know that. They see the concept as all coming down to that thing I put on the very second slide, a personal relationship with God. You don't need anybody else. Did I answer it, or are you not quite satisfied yet?
You know, you said this is a long debate, so.
Yeah, it goes on. Now, I don't get involved in ever discussing theology with them, okay? I mean, some groups say to me, like, the way you read from the Gospels, how can you not be a believer? You sound like you're a Christian. How can it possibly be? I say, look, my beliefs are my personal territory. I'm not getting involved in that. And I will discuss this. I will discuss this further on when we talk about the role of the tour guide and what your belief is. It doesn't. We'll get there. We'll get there. So there's a slide about it. Concerning Nazareth, is the Sisters of Nazareth Convent, Sisters of Nazareth Convent, a better place to visit than the Annunciation Church? No, absolutely not, because an order of nuns is something they can't even get their heads around. God says, go forth and multiply. Who the heck has no husband or no wife? It's like monasticism to them. And there was monasticism in Judaism as well. I mean, look at Samson. And look at the second century BC with the people. But look at early Christianity with Simon of Damascus on the pole and all those people. For them, they can't get their heads around that. So going to the Sisters of Nazareth, absolutely not. And when I do take them, if I take even the most fanatical ones, I take them to the church in Nazareth. I take them to the Annunciation Church for one very important reason: to go to Edward in the office, pay the extra 5 shekels a head, and go into the museum underneath. And in that museum, they see what's called in Hebrew michlaot. It's a cave, a sheepfold, a cave with a wall carved around it, which is exactly the description when Jesus teaches the parable of the Good Shepherd, how the shepherd lays across the front, and only a thief coming over the wall can get to his flock. So I use that to describe that, what Jesus is describing in that parable, because that's part of the culture of Jesus's era. Definitely, that's good. Not only that, but then you can talk about the findings of an oven in which the minimum number of breads you're going to bake there is like 60 loaves, monstrous. Why on earth would that be there? And that will get into that again in the 3rd section after the break.
It's a long.
The statue of Mary in processions. What if evangelists found the Ark of the Covenant? Would they carry it? Absolutely just to touch it. You know, every single, especially the end time ministry types, they always ask me, so where do you think the Ark of the Covenant is? And I say to them, well, we don't have any references. There are those that say they know where it is and it's somewhere hidden under the Temple Mount. There are, in the book of Maccabees, there's a reference to Jeremiah having hidden it in Mount Nebo, where Moses' burial place is, that nobody should know where it is until the coming of the Messiah. I say, so I don't have an opinion on where it is. Maybe you should ask Indiana Jones. And usually that makes them laugh, and that's the end of that discussion, because how the heck do we know where it is? What would they do if they saw it? I have no idea. I mean, they would believe, taking literally the biblical text, that because they're not Levites descended from Aaron, that if they touched it, they'd drop dead. So they dance around it, but they wouldn't carry it. Because of the excavations under the convent. The excavations under the convent. No, you mean the Mary Center, the Center of Mary in Nazareth, which is just behind the Annunciation Church. Yes, okay. I've taken.
Sorry, I think he's referring to the tomb of the righteous under the excavations under the Sisters of Nazareth.
Okay.
That's what he's referring to. There is that tomb of the righteous. There is an old house and all of that.
They'd have a little bit of an issue with that, you know, at least in the bottom level of the Annunciation Church. It's a very interesting, it's a beautiful structure, but it's not something that they're going to find immediate offense to. In a monastery, I don't know. They can see, if you know the church, the Center of Mary in Nazareth, which is if you go up the street where you turn into the Annunciation Church. You don't turn in, but you keep going up. You don't go into the market. You turn to the right, a little street that goes up to 20 meters. There's a place on the left called Centre de Marie de Nazareth. Okay, it's run by I forget the name of the order.
The New Way.
Yeah, the New Way. The New Way. Thank you. No, it's just called the New Way.
Yeah, but they wouldn't want to go there, trust me. It's all about Mary.
I know it's all about Mary, and I've taken people in just in order to show them the excavations.
Yeah.
You can't see a clear first century house, but you can certainly see the remains of something that was the foundation of a first century house for sure. They will prefer to see reconstruction like they have in Nazareth Village, even though the houses that are built in Nazareth Village are not accurate. But they'd still prefer to see that. So many evangelical groups in their program, they don't go to Nazareth at all. They just go to the village of Nazareth. Nazareth village.
אדריאן,
כן.
אנחנו כבר בערך שעתיים בשיעור הזה, ואנשים צריכים קצת הפסקה.
כן. צריך לעשות הפסקה עכשיו.
בואו נעשה איזו עצירה של כל השאלות, חלק מהשאלות לא ממש שייכות לסמינר.
ותשאירו לסוף גם.
כן, תשאירו גם קצת לסוף. חברים, אנחנו יוצאים עכשיו להפסקה של רבע שעה, שאחריה יהיה השיעור השלישי.
האחרון.
והאחרון. כן, אז יש עוד פעם קוד בצ'אט, ותצאו להפסקה של רבע שעה, זה בסדר, אדריאן?
כן.
בואו ניתן עוד טיפונת יותר, 12:20.
12:20, בסדר.
כאילו עכשיו שעתיים רצוף. 12:20, תשאירו את הזום דלוק, ותחזרו בדיוק בזמן, ותשמרו חלק מהשאלות לסשן הבא.
אוקיי. קפה.
חברים, צאו להפסקה, תנוחו קצת.
יאללה.
תשתו קפה, תאכלו ביסקוויטים.
אוקיי. יש פה שאלה אחת של ג'ו, do evangelicals ask what Jesus looked like? I'm going to cover that in the next section. They certainly know he didn't have blonde hair, blue eyes, etc. Okay, let's share screen again. Okay, for the tour guide, how will the group behave and how to behave with the group? So, biblical explanations, what is permitted and what is considered risky? Most evangelical believers do understand that problems exist in biblical translations into the modern languages from the original ones. As a result, they sometimes read many versions in a quest to get to the true meaning. So, first thing is, which Bible should you be working with when you're with an evangelical group? I don't think it matters. There are so many versions. I would say the most popular versions that they use are the ESV, the English Standard Version. I don't know the equivalent. I'm sorry, I don't know the equivalent in French and Italian and Spanish and all the other languages. I only know the English ones. They use the New International Version, NIV, for which the pre-2013 one is a good one. From 2013, they produced a new one, which is almost like coffee shop language, which is many of them find that it doesn't have the atmosphere of, let's say, the seriousness that the Bible is supposed to have, so they don't like that. When I point out issues of translation, they often say, so which is the best translation? There isn't a best translation, and very often they read across different versions, hoping that if there's a particular story they're looking for, they'll find in between the different versions something closer to which will give them the truth of that passage. Many have no idea how many or which biblical texts were given different or sometimes completely misleading meanings compared to the original. They do understand that the early language of the earliest church of Jesus and the disciples was Hebrew. We know this. I mean, there's the argument about Aramaic. That's a whole separate issue. There are just so many indicators and proofs from external writings from that era, inscriptions and everything else. We know that the dominant language in Herod's kingdom and the Hasmonean state from around 140 BC until around sometime after the Bar Kokhba revolt, we know that the main language used was Hebrew. We know, for example, there's never ever been a manuscript found or a manuscript related to in later texts in which parables have ever appeared in any language except Hebrew. And parables were taught in the spoken language, not in some hypothetical language. It's not like medieval Europe, where they would teach things in Latin, and the simple people didn't know that. They only know the local language. That's not the case. We have in many things, such as the Targumim. Many of them know about the Targumim, the translations from Hebrew into Aramaic. There are many Hebrewisms in the Aramaic, but there are almost no Aramaisms in the Hebrew. we're talking about things like the mention of the use of Aramaic, which almost entirely in the translations of the New Testament come from the time of St. Jerome's translation into the Latin. 16 times in the earliest Greek manuscripts of the Gospels, and we have now thousands of these available, 16 times throughout the whole New Testament, the word in Hebristi is mentioned. In other words, in Hebrew, such as said a person in, said a thing in Hebrew. And yet 15 out of those 16 times in St. Jerome's Vulgate in Latin, it says in Syriac, well, it says in Aramaic, but none of the Greek versions in any of those instances say in Syristi, which means they were speaking, Syristi is the Koine Greek version of the word for Aramaic. It means the Syrian language. So they're just endless proofs of that the central language at the time was Hebrew, and it comes out in many different. It comes out in Josephus, it comes out in Tacitus, in all these early writers. So most have no idea which of these texts has been changed at all. This comes from the fact that language is cultural, such that the original meaning in Hebrew or Greek reflects a cultural concept or a custom which may since have disappeared from the world, and is therefore entirely lost in much later translation done through the eyes of later translators with their understanding of their world and concepts from their later world. Yet in spite of this, this issue does not and should not affect the basic tenet of evangelical faith, that the scripture is the word of God, whether spoken or revealed through prophets or through disciples. Only ever express these ideas with care. It's imperative never to claim that there are mistakes in the Bible. If you do that, you're going to get in serious trouble with your group. Every remark or comment must only blame the translators, because they are not the word of God, the translators. They are trying to reflect it in a conversion into another language. The concept is the message is right, the message is accurate, but some things are lost by the translators because they didn't understand the culture, etc. at the time. This needs to be covered by an enriching explanation, not just to criticize it or the translators, but to give an explanation that gives them something that they can't understand from their own language. Otherwise, it's possible to ruin your relations with the pastor and the group. How to relate to biblical sites with evangelicals. There's great meaning with evangelicals in providing archaeological research findings for any site, not to get involved with what do I think they want to hear. Let me tell them a story that they want to hear, because your tip, your gratuity at the end of the tour is not going to be bigger if you invent stories or facts. On the contrary, it could even lead you to being fired in the middle of a tour. And this does happen. It can happen. You can tell the group that you are Catholic or Orthodox or Muslim or Jew, or even a total atheist. Although if you are an atheist, it's going to severely restrict how you can relate to the group. And they'll respect this. They'll respect whatever your faith is, as long as you equally respect their faith and the purpose of their visit. Whenever starting to introduce a site, I would say you concentrate on the history and archaeology relating to the biblical period, not later, and only use source material. Don't make up stories. When I say source material, I'm talking about academic references, academic records, writings from very early days. Don't make up stories. This will help you to earn the group's respect. If you go to a site and you say, look, we honestly don't know that this is the real place, but this is where many people come because it was marked out in the early period and we don't know where the real place is, they will respect that. If there's no proof of the authenticity of a site by ancient manuscript or archaeology from the biblical eras, say so. It's okay, because evangelicals respect honesty and truth, and they hate made-up stories. Unless you make up a story for the purpose of humor, there's nothing wrong with that. If your pastor doesn't want to read himself or herself from the biblical passages relating to the site you're visiting, and doesn't appoint a group member to read, then you either need to ask if anyone would like to do so, or even read it yourself if your reading in that language is clear and not monotonous. Read it as if you're reading from a play, as if you're acting it out. Evangelicals often also love to hear the cadences of the original Hebrew, as well as the prose sound of the Psalms. You can even sing to them. They'll love this. It's not enough. Now, this is something that I come across often. You know, when I cross over into Bethlehem, and I always take a local guide, and they quote chapter and verse without actually saying what the scripture says. And, you know, not everyone's got their Bible in front of them, and any parrot can do that. They're not yeshiva students with the whole Torah, much of the prophets memorized. They're not, you know, people who spent their entire lives memorizing the text. They know the text because they've read it many times, but they don't generally know much of it, if at all, by heart, off by heart. The verses need to be read, and they need to be read aloud. This also shows the group that their guide is Bible savvy, understanding the significance of the site, help them to connect to the site and to the land. And you need to set daily expectations. It's worthwhile, after settling into each hotel that you move into, or at the end of each day, sit with the pastor or the other tour leaders, if there's more than one, and go over the itinerary for the coming days to make sure that the way to say in English, in American English, that you're on the same page. Ask where he or she wants to teach and preach. These are the sites we've got tomorrow. We're going to be here, 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 here. Where do you want to talk? Where do you want to preach? Give the priority, or the zchut kadima, the right of way, to the group leader at every site they want, and only add afterwards. Never go into a site and say, I'm going to start this off. If the teacher wants to teach there, if the pastor wants to teach there, let them do that first. And then afterwards, you add what you can contribute, but you've got to be careful never to contradict the group leader. Understand that the pastor is the leader of the tour in everything to do with spiritual and biblical authority, not the tour guide. Remember that the pastor brought the group, and he or she is their community leader. He or she is the reason they're coming and the reason you've been hired. They are the boss. If the pastor tells the group something, even if it's misinformed, never, ever offer a correction in front of the group. You can wait for a private conversation, maybe over dinner or in the lobby with a coffee, and in a respectful, when it's just the pastor, maybe the pastor and his wife, maybe the pastor and her husband. Not good usually to do this in front of other members of the group. You could do it when you're getting off the bus or walking to the hotel after the end of a day's tour. And you can say, you know, something that you said at such and such a site, I've got a different or an alternative perspective on something that you taught there. Would you like to hear about it? Would you be interested in hearing about it? And generally, they'll always say, sure, yes. They tend to be very open to these things. That's the way to do it. And then maybe the next time they come, they'll adjust what they say if it's something that's misinformed. Some of them will even say in front of the group, and this has happened to me, you know something? Yesterday I talked about such and such and such thing. That's what I got from my seminary. That's whatever I thought. But I'd like you to hear this alternative view of it that the tour guide has got, and go ahead and explain it. When you've done that, it means you've established a relationship with the leader where you're showing that you respect them as the tour leader. You're not trying to contradict them in front of the group. You're showing them something new, and they will generally want the group to hear that. Not all, but many. Daily prayer. And this is the same for any, I mean, it's just, you have daily prayers if you come, more than one daily prayer, if you come if you're working with a Catholic or an Orthodox or any sort of group. Most groups will expect to start the day every day with a prayer, such as once to get on the bus in the morning, Some groups, they get them up at like 5:30, 6 o'clock, and they have a prayer session before, and then they go to breakfast, and you'll need to take a room for them to do that. That's very common. But this concept of the morning opening prayer on the bus is often a rotation. And it's either led by the pastors or it's led by other group members who will take turns on different days. Some groups come and they've got a list. So-and-so is going to do the morning prayer on this day, this one's going to do it on that day, this one's going to do the closing prayer. The pastors often, sometimes when they're not teaching, they like to take a step back and let the people in the group be involved and do a little bit of reading. They'll often want to read for a particular psalm about somewhere they're going to, and then they'll give a little talk about it, and that's your morning prayer. If you're with a Catholic group, that's usually going to be a decade of the Rosary and something like that. But this is very different. They don't have a Rosary, okay? So leave them in peace and quiet during this, just as with a Catholic group when they're praying on the bus, or any other Christian denomination. You should not disturb. You have to respect that time. So there's not the time to get involved in a cell phone conversation. Either you or the driver. Make sure the driver is quiet during these times when they're praying. The microphone at the front picks it up. It picks up the driver. It picks up you when you hand the microphone over to someone to give that morning prayer. And it shows unnecessary disrespect. Nevertheless, the tour leader knows that the guide is the one responsible for the itinerary and the timing. Therefore, if you've got a morning journey that's very, very short, I'll give you an example. Let's say you're staying at one of the hotels near Migdal, and your first trip is to Magdala. You're going to have like 30 seconds before you arrive. So if the morning journey is short, well, if you're staying, say, in the Leonardo, and you're going to go through the Herod Gate, you've got maybe 7 minutes before you get there. If the morning journey is short, we'll discuss this with the pastor and allot them on alternative time, maybe at the first site for prayer. And the same thing at the end of the day. These prayers that often come with readings, they generally don't last for more than 5 to 10 minutes. Respect that, make sure they've got that. And especially with people who you can see are very moved with something. Like I gave you that example of something that happened to me at Shiloh with more than once, at Shiloh and at Bethel, especially with these people. You need to give them that time. Even though I'd planned to talk about all sorts of other stuff, I realized it's overkill. It's too much information. They can't take it in because something has moved them. So be sensitive to these moments and be prepared to change what your plan was of what you were going to say and how much you were going to say when you realize that people need time for themselves. And literally they will tell you, we need time with God right now. Leave us alone. Sometimes they won't, but you can sense that they need that and you need to give it to them. Within any evangelical group, there may be members whose coming to faith involved escaping alcoholism. I once had a group where, well, I didn't even know this beforehand, but I discovered that the pastor had served a prison sentence of 6 years for drug distribution. Almost a third of his groups had been in jail for drug offenses. Some more of them had been in jail for violent crimes, including manslaughter. A couple of the women had been involved in prostitution. It was a very, very unusual group. And this guy came to faith in prison, and some of the people in his prison, and he worked with released prisoners, and his whole ministry was among those people. So that was a little bit of an experience. But because so many have come to faith out of alcoholism, you can assume that there'll be no consumption of any form of alcohol permitted during the tour. This means that if they're going to have the Lord's Supper, communion, you need to make sure they've got grape juice, not wine. In a group where this is the case, you, the tour guide, should not be seen drinking alcohol anywhere near the group. Just the same as you shouldn't be smoking in front of the group. Even if half your group is smokers, you'll find very, very few evangelicals who actually smoke. This sounds silly, but it's very important. Never flirt with a participant. Conversations with members of the group must be respectful, add to the atmosphere of study for the visit, but they can be humorous too. If you have a pastoral group, and there are many who are like this, who love to joke and to laugh and to make fun of themselves even over meals or in the lobby or in general, then feel free to participate. But this should be at the initiative of the leaders of the group, not the guide. However, do not tell sexual innuendo jokes. Most evangelicals consider them to be immoral. So you can't use certain terms. You can't tell dirty jokes or something like that. You can't do that with these people. That will disturb them. And they'll start to wonder, who is this person? Do they really understand where we're coming from that they tell a joke like that? It's just going to damage your relationship. You have to be sensitive to the group. And every church, again, I repeat, if you can get online and find out more about their church before they come, because every single church, the majority of them are independent, they're self-run churches, they're self-financing churches, they're not connected to any greater organization. They can be very, very different. If you can get online and find out about that church and what their principles are, you're going to be well prepared. And if you don't understand, then you want to speak to the pastor. The very first opportunity you have, even as you walk into the bus and people are getting their luggage loaded from at the airport or at the crossing from Jordan or wherever it is, and try and find out what is important to them. What are their, what are their, where do you stand on this? Where do you stand on that? What sort of morning and evening prayers do you want to have? What's your approach to alcohol? You'll find that they tend to dress conservatively as well. Most evangelical groups dress quite conservatively. You won't find, any women with a cleavage showing or anything like that. There's nothing. They tend to be very conservative in their dress because they tend to have very strict moral codes. Okay, we're coming towards the last major section, and we've got an hour and 20 minutes for this. Okay, and questions. So I'm going now into fields of things that you can contribute to a group, even if you've got a pastor that likes to preach all the time in different sites and doesn't leave you that much time to talk about the site or to do any other any insights. We're going to section G and section H. They're all about this, and how to deal with the concept of fables or old wives' tales or sipurei savta in an evangelical style. Right. It's very rare that a pastor will object to a tour guide enlightening a group on biblical concepts, especially if they come from inaccurate translations, especially if you avoid anything controversial that's presented by you, not as biblical errors, but as translation errors. That is legitimate in their eyes. And I'm going to give you an example here. Was Jesus born on Christmas Day? No. The Gospels are specific. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph lived by the Hebrew lunar calendar, not the existent Roman one. All Christians believe that Mary's pregnancy, which is referred to by the Roman churches as the incarnation, began the very moment the angel Gabriel spoke the word. In Luke's Gospel 1:26, when it says in the 6th month, it doesn't refer to June. It's not referring to the Roman calendar. Mary and Joseph would never have, probably not even known what the Roman calendar was. It doesn't refer to anything other than the identical expression in 1 Chronicles 27:9, in Ezekiel 8:1, and in Haggai 1:15, and not even connected to a relation to a calendar in Luke 1:36. It means the Hebrew 6th month, called since the Babylonian exile, the month of Elul. And this is the month of reckoning and repentance. It's the end of the summer and it's the start of the autumn. So Jesus would have been born in the 3rd month of the following year, in the month of Sivan, which is around Shavuot, Pentecost. Because this, oh, okay, in the spring we have a similar situation, but that only conforms if you go by June, which is wrong. So it's the only time when the shepherds are not in the hills, but they're invited after the harvests and after the gleaning into the fields. The gleaning, remember the story of gleaning? It's a commandment in the Torah that when you have reaped your harvest of your field, you have to leave a border around the field where you do not reap. And that is for the widows and the orphans and the poor to come and take what they need. Just like in the story of Ruth, the way she does that with Naomi in the field of Boaz. They're very aware of this. So, if the rest of the year, if you were to invite shepherds into your field, they're going to eat the crop. They're going to destroy your livelihood. You'd sue them. They'd have to give up their flocks as payment. So you don't get shepherds in fields except after a harvest, after the gleaning, because those people are gleaning and they're going to take that wheat as an offering to the temple. In the Second Temple Judea at Shavuot, Jews also celebrated the giving of the Torah. To this day, it's called Chag Matan Torah at Mount Sinai. But it was also the time that they celebrated the birth of King David. So here you have within the text a remez, a scriptural hint with great significance. The time of his birth, the time of the new covenant giver, the time of the descendant of David is deeply connected to that time. They know that December the 25th has pagan Roman roots. It was the annual date of the worship of the god Mithras. Similarly, they know Easter. Easter was a pagan spring festival. The concept of Easter, they don't call it that. There are many evangelicals who look at the appointed times, and we tend to call these the Jewish festivals or the appointed times of Israel, but that's not what it says in Leviticus. In Leviticus 23, it says, these are my appointed times, his, God's. And they say, well, we should be observing them, just as Jesus did. But they add to that the celebration of what they call the Resurrection Festival, not the crucifixion, the Resurrection Festival, to celebrate the resurrection at the time of what other people call Easter. The Gospels were first distributed among the Jews, mainly verbally. It's not for nearly close to 20 years that anyone writes any of this down. Only during Peter's later ministry were Gentiles involved. So these biblical remez hints would mean nothing to the Gentiles who didn't know Jewish life in the Second Temple era if they're living in Asia Minor, where the church starts to boom, or in Syria, or in Egypt. These remez hints are only relevant to someone who has the biblical text memorized and can relate to them. And Jesus uses this so widely. This concept of remez, which is actually a rabbinical concept. Was Jesus born in the year 0 of the current era? No. The Gospels tell us that he was born during the period of Herod the Great, who died in 4 BC. This is the same Herod who received the Magi, probably at Herodian, after which, according to Matthew 2:16, all firstborn Jewish sons of the region under 2 years old were put to death. So Jesus was born in 6 to 4 BC. The Roman calendar of 0 was not set until centuries later. Centuries later. It always went by the year of the emperor. Such and such a year of this emperor, such and such a year of that emperor. These are examples of misnomers, of misconcepts, okay, that you're fine to talk about. You don't have any problem talking about this sort of stuff, pardon me, with evangelical groups. Joseph, Jesus' father, was a carpenter. Was he? Wrong, at least according to today's meaning. The Greek word used in all the earliest gospel manuscripts, and we have 3rd century, even a few 2nd century, not complete gospels, but partial ones, is remade every single instance he's referred to Joseph as a tekton. a profession which disappeared over time. Its meaning is the man who's invited to come and look at an area of land designated for building. He creates a construction plan. He calculates the quantities of materials needed, the stone, the wood, and the plaster perhaps. He may be the one to quarry the stones. He's certainly going to be the mason that cuts them and to cut the wood, but also the one who actually builds. A tekton was an architect, an engineer, and a contractor, all in one. The profession is mentioned in the Talmud as a highly respected profession with a very long apprenticeship, and also in Greek sources as well. So he wasn't just making tables and chairs. He was a man with a highly respected profession. Why, this is connected to the next point. Why did Joseph from Bethlehem in Judea live in Nazareth of Galilee? Again, we're not told in the Gospels why. We're simply told the fact that he did move, coming back from Egypt, took Mary and Jesus to live in Nazareth. Well, why would he do that? Is it to fulfill some prophecy? Well, you can relate a certain prophecy to that, but there's a much more logical, historical, practical explanation. And you can get into that without treading on any dangerous ground with the group. And it's giving them a better feel for the things that happened in the Gospels. On the death of Herod the Great in 4 BC, we know from records, not just Josephus, that there was a big rebellion happened in the Galilee, based in the regional capital, Sepphoris. The response of the man who inherited, one of his sons who inherited the Galilee, Herod Antipas, was to bring an army to the city and to utterly destroy it, including killing most of its inhabitants. But Herod Antipas, the fox, this is the Herod of the John the Baptist story, had to have a capital in his new territory. So immediately afterwards, Antipas began rebuilding the city with a mixed population of Greeks, Jews, and Samaritans, which had been his father's policy building Caesarea. Herod's idea in building Caesarea with a mixed population, we know this, we learned it on the tour guide course, was that no two groups would gang up together against him because their conflicts between them were greater than anything that could bring them together against him as the king. So Antipas copies this policy when he rebuilds Sepphoris. And this is proven to us in the revolt. In the Great Revolt, Sepphoris refused to join the rebellion. They opened their gates to Vespasian because they were more worried about their prosperity, and there was no single group that could dominate the local council to say, let's fight the Romans. Nazareth was simply a very close by Jewish town. You can do it from the area, underneath the Annunciation Church and the little valley there where a few things were found in the area of the Nazareth village. You can walk from there to Sepphoris, if you didn't have all the construction in the way, in about 40-something minutes, certainly under an hour. So they wouldn't want to, what would they do if Joseph went there with Mary and a baby, Jesus, or a young child, a toddler? Would you want to live in a tent around the ruins while you're involved in building there? Or would you want to live somewhere where you could connect to your own life? Nazareth was a perfect solution for this. The result of Antipas's work, according to Josephus, is work for thousands of tektons. A great reason. I mean, living in Bethlehem, how many houses was he going to get to build? It's only a small little village. Going to a project like this, it would mean prosperity for his family, for providing for his family. Historical logic can explain many biblical events. This is a great one. Nazareth, what good came out of Nazareth? You read that verse spoken by Nathanael when Philip brings Jesus to him near Cana in John's Gospel, John 1 actually. Was Nazareth a bad place? A desolate place? No. Nazareth was the home of a whole clan of Kohanim, Aaronic Levitical priests, the Hapitzetz family, who served 2 weeks a year in the Jerusalem sanctuary. We get the name of that family. It's mentioned in 1 Chronicles 24, and then it's renewed by Ezra the scribe in the Return to Zion from Babylon, when he sets up the same group of 24 clans of priests to serve in the temple that's being rebuilt. Jews in Galilee were under Pharisee influence. They were not ruled by the Sadducee aristocracy like in Jerusalem. Every child in every village went to the synagogue school. They learned the Torah off by heart in the weekly readings that would be read out weekly in the synagogue on a Shabbat to the whole community. But on a daily basis, those children, just like the Yemenite Jews have continued to do for 2,000 years, they get them to repeat and repeat and repeat verse by verse until they've got it stuck in the memory. And believe me, the brain of a 5, 6, 7-year-old child, they know it by heart. And when they finish that section of their schooling by 8 or 9 years old or so. So the people in Galilee did not judge people by whether they were wealthy or aristocrats. They valued Torah knowledge and learning, great rabbis and thinkers, people who could tell them this biblical commandment of the 613 commandments. I don't understand. How am I supposed to do that? How am I supposed to walk in obedience to God's commandments? And the people who became called rabbis were the ones that gave them the simplest way to live it out, the simplest way, the easiest way to be obedient to this commandment. That was what they respected. The Mishnah, which although it's put together on paper in around the year 200 in Galilee, but most of its source material is taken from as far back as the Great Assembly, going back to the time before the Hasmoneans even. The Mishnah mentions none of these great teachers being from Nazareth. It mentions from Gamla, it mentions from Gush Chalav or Jish, it mentions from all sorts, from the Arbel Mountains, it mentions from all over the place. It doesn't mention anyone from Nazareth. Nathanael of Cana meant by this statement in his day that Nazareth had yet to produce a great teacher. That's what he means by that, not that it's a crappy place. Was Jerusalem's praetorion at Antonia, and I use if you bear with me, I use the Greek words for these things because that was the language that we're using here, not Latin. Definitely not. No praetorian in the entire Roman Empire was based in a garrison if the city had a palace too. They were all based in royal palaces. Praetorion in Greek or praetorium in Latin means the home and the headquarters of the praetor, the ruler, and it's a palace. The only praetorium in Jerusalem was Herod's palace, high on the city's western edge. The Crusaders were the one who invented the Antonia idea as the place of Jesus's trial by Pilate, 1,070 years after it took place. Go back to the Byzantines, the Byzantine Via Dolorosa, the Byzantine route of the cross, which wasn't something to praise 14 stations, it was merely a pilgrimage route, was nowhere near that part of town. They based their assumption on what they knew and what they brought with themselves from Europe. Feudal, early medieval Europe, rulers lived in castles surrounded by moats with big fortified walls, and at the center of it was a keep, the super fortified central fortress. That's where they lived. And so for them, the concept of a ruler living in a garrison was normal to them. So they could come to this conclusion. They were familiar with this from feudal. All the remains of Herod Palace were buried under rubble by the 11th century. So they created a new site because they needed to commemorate the trial and to perform the Catholic ritual there. They needed it. It's understandable why, but it's not authentic. This is a great one. And I don't know how this appears in other languages, but I do know how this appears in English. This is a question that is asked in John 21. When Jesus appears for the third time, according to the text itself, it says for the third time after the resurrection in Galilee. Where that appears in I'm not going to go into that. I think it's Mark's Gospel this appears in, and it doesn't appear in any of the early manuscripts. It was something that was added later because it was seen to be missing. So when it says Simon, son of John, he calls him Simon, son of John, being Peter. Do you love me? More than these. Did Jesus ask this same question 3 times? Do you love me? No. The Greek ancient manuscripts show different expressions for love. Agape and philia, which for those of you who speak Hebrew, I don't know about other languages, they have a parallel in ahava, ahva, and re'ut. It's also 100% certain they were not speaking Greek. More and more scholars are coming to realize from the nuances and the early gospel manuscripts that they were speaking in Hebrew. Many pastors, especially those who studied at seminary, will know this fact of the different questions, that these questions weren't, do you love me, do you love me, do you love me? They know that he's asking different questions of Peter because he's trying to see how far Peter will go in committing. So if you know this story, and if you don't, I'll just go into it for a moment for you. The first question he asks him is, do you love me? Using the word philia. In other words, do you love me with a comrade-like, a brotherly love? And Peter says, yes, Lord, you know I do. He says to him, tend my sheep. Then he asks him again. He wants to see if Peter will go up a level. And he asks him, do you love me? Using the word agape, which is a type of venerating love. It's someone you really, really look up to. Someone who you literally hang on every single word, and you're totally committed to them. It would the way a disciple, a talmid, would be with his rabbi. Peter can't give that commitment, and he answers him, yes, I philia you. In other words, he cannot commit to that extra super level of love that Jesus is asking. Can you go there, Peter? All in a word. And you don't get any of that when it's love, love, love 3 times. And then the third time, and this is something really, I've heard this taught by some pastors. It's a beautiful thing to teach. The third question, Jesus comes down a step and he says to him, Peter, do you philia me? And that's when Peter gets upset. He says, yes, Lord, you know I do. You know everything. Why is he getting upset? Because he's come back, he's come and asked him the same question the third time that he asked him the first time that he's already committed. But what is actually happening here? This is you know, I don't take any credit for this, of course. This is more than one pastor I've heard teach this, is that Jesus meets you not where you want to be, not where you aspire to be, but where you are at in that moment. And people can so relate to that. So if you've got a pastor that knows that and teaches that, great, when you get to Tabcha. If you don't, I mean, I'm not saying you should preach to the group, but you can explain that and you will get incredible credit for it. They will think, wow, this guy's got insights into the Bible, this guide that we've never even thought about. But you're going to come across a lot of pastors who already teach that. Well, this is an example of what you can do to give them the enrichment that they intended to find when they came here. Okay, this is pretty much the last section. I'll go into a lot wider detail than the couple of slides that I've got here for this. The meaning of biblical names. Evangelicals love them. It's extremely rare. Hang on, if this is H, yes, this is H. Okay, we're at the end. It's extremely rare that evangelicals will know the original meanings of biblical names. to explain them substantially enriches their visit. Now, I have worked with groups, and I know that possibly many of you have worked with groups where you come with an incredible scholar who knows the Greek, who knows the Hebrew, and that you feel like that, what on earth can I contribute? You know, I can tell them the stories, I can tell them a few jokes. What can I really contribute where they will think, wow, we've not only brought a great scholar with us, but we've got a really interesting guide. We want him or her next time. So this is one road into that, dealing with the biblical names, because there's so much to draw from every one. You can start with it in the New Testament, Gospel of Matthew 1:21. Okay, so give me a second. I'm just going to read this to you from the ESV Bible, okay? And take it in its context, always in its context. Here we are, Matthew 1:21. She will bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. That's Matthew 1:21, okay? I take that verse, especially I do this, I even do this with Catholic groups when I'm in Nazareth. And I say, why Jesus? How about this? How about this? She will bear a son, and you will call his name Jim, because he will save his people from their sins. She will bear a son, and you will call his name Fred, Bill, because he will save his people from their sins. The sentence doesn't make sense. Why that specific name? Well, and many evangelicals, great numbers of evangelicals know that his original name was Yeshua, from the Hebrew root, meaning savior. So if you read this again as, she will bear a son, and you shall call his name Savior, for he will save his people from their sins, that is added value for those who don't know it. That's the sort of thing a guide can contribute, which you may see as a very little thing, but it's a big thing. Was the prophet's name Elijah? No, his name was Eliyahu, meaning my God is Yahweh. He lived in a time of many false gods and many false prophets. His name illustrates how he is distinguished from all the other prophets of the time and how his God is the real God. That's what his name means. Was his name Elijah? I mean, the biblical writers put his name down as Elijah, but was that really his name? We don't even know. It may have been something else, but he was called Elijah. In other words, his name reflects his role in the biblical narrative. You explain that, you've got credit points. This is one of the big ones. And this is from Luke 19, the beginning of Luke 19, before the Palm Sunday thing. Was the Jericho tax collector in Luke 19 named Zacchaeus? No. That's a Greek name. His Hebrew name was Zacchaeus. Think about this. He was accused of being a cheat. He claimed when he climbed the tree that he was innocent of the charges. Zacchaeus in Hebrew means innocent, as he gave not the required 10% of his income to the poor, but a whole 50%. And anyone who ever accused him of cheating, he would pay them back fourfold, full biblical recompense. This man is a tzaddik, meaning a righteous man. But in order to speak to Jesus, to see him, because he was short, he climbed a sycamore fig tree. In Hebrew, a sycamore fig tree is a shikma, from the root Shechem. By climbing that fig tree and having this conversation where he's able to claim his innocence and to give his evidence that he gives 50% to the poor and he's repaid fourfold anyone who he believes he may have cheated, he is able to rehabilitate himself in public. In Hebrew, this is lehishtakem, from the root word of Shechem. As such, Jesus is convinced that this is a righteous man and decided that he was worthy, in Hebrew, zakai, for him to go to his home and eat at his table. You have not, by telling this story this way, you have not changed anything. You have not changed the story in any way, but you have given them an insight into the meaning of the words, the meaning of the names, which is something that runs entirely through the Old Testament and is continued in the New Testament. And they love continuances which run through both sides of the Bible. For them, it just helps prove that it's all part of one ongoing series of revelations, of divine revelation. So that is, this is a biggie. You can do these things endlessly. Many of the biblical characters tell their role in the biblical narrative. Think of Peter. Think of Matthew 16. You are Petros, the little stone. And on this Petra, on this big great rock, I will build my community, which is generally translated as church. How about Naomi's sons? What's their role in the Bible? Their role is to go, because of a famine, is to go to Moab and die. That's their role. What's their name? Machlon, sickness, and Kilion, ailing. I mean, their names tell you that that's what they're going to do. They're just going to die. What about Orpha? That's a great one. Orpha is the daughter-in-law. What does she do? Does she go like Ruth does and say, where you go, I shall go? No. Orpha turns her shoulder on her mother-in-law and goes back to her people. She turns her Oreph. That's her name, Orpha. How about Shlomo, Solomon? We know from different parts of the Bible that his name is actually Yedidiah, friend of God. Tell them what that means. Why is he called Shlomo? Because his kingdom was a peaceful one after all the wars that David, his father, had had. You know, he has his issues with Pharaoh Shishak, but it's a peaceable kingdom of trade and development and construction. That's why his name is called that. It's actually the only peaceful kingdom. How about Isaiah? I mean, even those of you who don't guide in Hebrew, you guide in other languages, but you know, even if your first language is Arabic, because you know enough Hebrew to be able to know what these original names are and to develop with them with these people, because they won't know this. Isaiah, Yesha Yahu. God is the one to save. David, meaning a friend. Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu, at a time when everything was going to be lost and no one would listen to him, God raises up this man to try and bring the people back to him. Yirmiyahu, the one who God raises up. Elisha, God saves. How about Jezebel? This is a great one. Izebel, the trasher, the one who ruins true faith in the northern kingdom. Yerovam, very interesting, but Yerovam, the one who will enlarge the people, and Rehavam, the one who will widen the people, very similar names, Rehoboam, Jeroboam. In English, they're just fancy names. They don't mean anything. What about Jehoshaphat? God will judge. There's just so many of these. There's just so many of these, and you just have to read through your Bible and you come across a name. Another example will be, let's look at who was the servant, or he sees himself as a servant, who was working with Elijah when Jezebel was persecuting everybody. And he is the one that hid the prophets of the true God in caves by 50s and brought them bread and water. What's he doing? He's doing God's work. What's his name? It says in the Bible, isn't it, in the English version anyway, Obadiah, which is a name that always cracks me up when people do it in a southern accent. Obadiah, what does his name mean? Ovadia, servant of God. He's doing God's work. I mean, there's no end to this. There's literally no end to this. Look at Peter's original name, Shimon, the listener. He's listening to Jesus. He's listening. I think there's just so much scope for you as a guide to go into these things, to go into these people's names, and to explain what they are, what they mean, how it describes the biblical role of these people. It's a great field. You're not going to tread on any wrong feet. You're not going to get anybody upset. You're going to give them a wow moment. And it's really good to do that. It's really valuable to do that. So I've finished the main section of this, finished what I wanted to present to you in the presentation. And I want to use here someone who I've seen very much as my teacher, Professor Wave Nunnally from Evangel University in Springfield, Missouri. I want to give you a little bit of information about this man. He is a Pentecostal scholar. He understands biblical Hebrew. He understands biblical Greek. He's read many dozens, hundreds of the early fractions of manuscripts of the very early church in Greek. He reads Aramaic when it's written, not in Syriac, but in Hebrew. He knows, he quotes from the Mishnah widely in order to show what customs were around Jesus's time, in order to explain some of the things that he says in the gospel. He was here, he did his second master's degree in Jerusalem, and as a part of that, he was with one of his colleagues in the Rockefeller Museum, and they got to know the curator. They got to be very pally with him, and there was a cupboard there, a locked cupboard, in which they asked the curator, you know, what's in here that we've not seen yet, because they were taking the Dead Sea Scrolls and reading them. These guys, they could read them, whether Hebrew or Greek, they could read them. And the curator said, "Oh, it's lots of fragments. It's nothing, you know, nothing significant. It's not really been annotated or published yet." They quite naughtily broke into this cupboard when the curator left them with the key, because he trusted them. And they took this document that they found inside, which was about half a scroll, and they translated it and they published it. This is the sort of person you're talking about. Just an incredible person. And this is, I think, is something which gives a perspective. This is something I learned from him my very first time when I was pretty much a quiet guide with him, writing notes. It's impossible. What he does, he uses two Greek expressions, and I'll explain these when I've read the quote. It's impossible to separate the biblical texts from the geographic, cultural, and spiritual context in which the events took place. Connected aspects such as landscape, topography, cultures, and the political historical context are critical in understanding the scriptures. Little to nothing can be understood by interpreting scripture through the lens of the geographical and cultural norms of our world today. He separates this into two definitions in Greek. I'll come to that in a moment. He separates the first one, exegesis in Greek. That means if you want to understand something from Homer in the Greek writers or from Virgil of the Latin writers, then to understand what they're talking about, truly understand it and not falsely interpret their text, you have to study the culture of the time, the customs of the time, the climate, everything that could affect their life. And only when you understand that can you really understand what they're talking about in what they wrote down. And you need to interpret that through their eyes, through the people who lived in those times. He said that is correct biblical study, exegesis. The opposite is eisegesis. Eisegesis is where you say, well, this is what I know in my world. I know what this means today. My world is as it is, and I'm going to look back now into a biblical text 2,000 or 3,000 years old, and interpret what happened then through my own understanding from my own world. And that, he says, is the totally wrong way to study scripture, how you can never get anything right. Because your culture, our cultures today, is not the cultures of the people in the Bible. I think that's one of the most major statements I can say. And I think that the groups so appreciate you helping them with their modern concepts understand the biblical eras in the context. You can give them added value, not as a preacher, not as a pastor, but as a tour guide who is taking them back into that time, into those times. And one of the classic examples of this would be, I'm going to quit sharing. Somebody asked me about the course. I've got the details of the course here. I'll come back to that. But for the moment, I'm going to do a stop share and just talk to you, because we've got 40 minutes. I want to go on for about another 10 minutes. I'm going to literally have half an hour for whatever questions you want. I can already see some great stuff here. One of the classic things, and this is again his explanation of names, okay, is Abraham. Abraham and the story of Isaac. Okay, what does that tell us in the story? I believe this is in 22. Excuse me a moment. I'm not a pastor. I don't remember chapter numbers. I've got my cheat sheet that I take around with me everywhere. That's got the list of the things. It's a very, very detailed cheat sheet, but I believe it's in. I know which parasha it's in. I just don't know which. Oh, Exodus, come on. By the way, I do recommend with Evangelicals, if you use the ESV Bible, it's got its own search engine. You can search for a word. If you want to, you say you go to Capernaum, you type in Capernaum, it'll show you every mention of Capernaum throughout. You go to any place, you write it down. It's just an incredible tool. Genesis. Yes, here we go. Genesis 22. After these things, God tested Abraham, and said to him, Abraham. And he said, Hineni, here I am. And he said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, the first mention of the word love in the Bible, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I tell you. I'm going to look at that in the Hebrew just to be sure that that is reasonably accurate. Bereshit. Because I always have to check this out. Sometimes things are right, offer him as a burnt offering. Okay, what's going on here? If you look at the later Jewish biblical commentators, people like Rashi, who lived in France in the 9th century, or people even like the person considered the greatest sage of all, Maimonides, who grew up in the Umayyad Caliphate in Spain before the reconquest. And you read what they have to about how they try and explain this, you realize they're using eisegesis. They are not putting their minds back in Abraham's time. I've looked at this particular story is the only one that I've really gone into great detail, looking at all the interpretations. And I've probably missed out on some much earlier rabbi that gives a better explanation when he's living in the land. But even then it wouldn't be that accurate. I've not come across it. But let's think about what's going on. Abraham comes from a time, we're talking about early in the 2nd millennium BC, when the norm in most ancient religions, not all, but most, was when things weren't going well for you, they would offer their firstborn children. We even read much, much later, 1,000 years later, when the peoples of Babylon and around there are brought by Tiglath-Pileser III and Sargon II, they bring them to settle in the towns and the villages of Samaria after exiling the people from there. what do? It tells us at the very end of 2 Kings, and it says the people of the Sepharvaim burned their sons on the altars to Adramelech, because that was their way. So in other words, what does it mean, Moriah? Well, it doesn't say Mount Moriah. Nowhere does it say Mount Moriah. It says to the place, the area, the land of Moriah. So I talk to people about what does it mean, Moriah? More, teacher. Mori, my teacher. Moriah, God is my teacher. God is taking Abraham to educate him in 3 fundamentals. Number 1, with me, there will be no child sacrifice. With me, it will not be that way. You're not going to do that. You're not even going to think of it. Number 2, I keep my promises. If I promised you that through this son, your descendants will be like the stars of heaven, I will not break that promise. I would never have allowed you to take his life. I keep my promises. And this is something that's very, very important to evangelicals. They believe that God keeps all his promises, that he's not inconsistent, and that he never contradicts himself. Number 3, trust. Put your total trust in me. And that one is the one that Abraham gets right. He's prepared to do this because this is the God that he talks to him. He believes in. So he's learning 3 lessons. Moriah, God is my teacher. That's a classic example of how you can give something to a group that they're never going to get themselves. They might guess it if they know the Hebrew, but it's very unlikely, because most of these names in the Bible, they're just exotic sounding things, very exotic sounding things. So I don't get into theology with them. I'd recommend you don't get into theology with them. It's not really relevant. That's not what they're here for, to have a theological discussion. I always, those of you who guided this sort of group, they'll take you aside in the evening over, they'll sit with you at the table, or they'll come after you're sitting with your dessert at the hotel, and they'll start asking you all sorts of questions, and it does go into theological stuff. That's fine because they initiate it. But you shouldn't ever try and convince them if you think differently. Just, say, well, this is what they'll say. What do Jews think about that? What do Muslims think about that? What do Catholics think about that? Because that's who you are. You can give your point of view. They're not going to be offended by it, because they know that not everyone thinks the way they do. They're not living in a cocoon, although some of them do. Okay, time to answer some questions. I can see there are. Okay. I'm going to open it up. I'm going to answer all the questions that are in here, all these messages, and I'm going to give time, at least 15 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes, for you to ask verbally the questions. So if you want to hold off, go. So the first thing is, do evangelicals ask what Jesus looked like? I say, I like to take a lot of groups to Tzipori. Why? Because it's almost unthinkable that Joseph didn't work there as a tekton among the 10,000 that were employed there. It's almost unthinkable. You can be sure that he worked there. So when you are a 14-year-old boy, Jewish kid in Galilee, and you've been through your synagogue education, through the Beit Sefer to the Beit Midrash to the Beit Talmud, you've learnt the prophets, you've learnt the oral interpretations of the commandments, then what's going to happen to you? What's going to happen to you is that if you're an exceptionally brilliant scholar, your Bible teacher, who's nothing more than a Bible teacher, who's teaching you in the synagogue school, will say, you know what, you've got such potential. You can learn even more than I know. I'm going to send you to a real teacher. Maybe he'll allow you to become one of his disciples. You can learn so much more. And this will happen maybe 1 kid in 1,000. And you may be in contact with some great teacher, and you'll send them with a letter. Send this kid. I mean, you have to be literate. You'll be among the 5% of people who are literate, because you're reading from the text to teach the kids who are learning it off by heart and may not be literate. And you'll send them to another teacher. That kid will come to this teacher and say, so-and-so from so-and-so, such an area, Cana, Arbel, wherever it was, said that maybe I could become one of your disciples because I can learn more. And that teacher will look at this kid and say, really? Okay, I know him. He's quite a good teacher, but I don't get many exceptional students from him. You think you can learn with me? You need to know your scriptures. And the kid will say, well, I do. You say, okay, recite the book of Jeremiah. And he's got to recite the whole book of Jeremiah from heart. Then he may give him some really serious challenge and say, how many times does the tetragrammaton, the 4-letter word of God's name, appear in the book of Isaiah? What does the kid do? He shuts his eyes. He's spinning through the memorized texts, counting, because they're all numerate. And if he passes that sort of text, he will be accepted to become a disciple, a talmid of this great teacher, because that teacher becoming your talmid means that that teacher's got to provide for this kid as well. He's got to provide him with shelter. He's got to provide him with his food. So it's a commitment, and he'll only do it if he really thinks someone's got potential. Just imagine, and I like to talk about this on the edge of the Sea of Galilee. Why on earth would Jacob, referred to in English as James for some wacko reason of King James, why would Yaakov and Yochanan and John drop their nets and run after Jesus? Well, we know from the text that Zebedee was partners on his boat. It wasn't just him. They're not abandoning his father totally and ruining his profession and his income. They've probably got first cousins working there. But these are kids who've been rejected by their Bible teacher. They're not considered brilliant scholars. They've not been taken as a talmid of a great teacher. And yet Jesus sees the potential in them. And when he says, follow me, and he's already a known teacher, he's got a reputation, they race after him. They drop everything and God. It's an unbelievable honor. Look at it that way. So, and I'm distracting myself again, but these are the sort of things that come out of understanding late Second Temple era Jewish life in Galilee that these visitors won't have thought of. And so when what does he do? What does he criticize in Matthew? I believe it's Matthew 23, when he criticizes the Pharisees. What does he say to them? He says, listen to them and do as they teach, but don't do as they do, for they don't follow what they teach, and they lay burdens on people. In other words, lots of rules and regulations that they don't keep themselves. He's criticizing them for that. So what does it happen when you go to become the talmid of a rabbi, the paid expenses paid student of a rabbi in those eras? What did it mean? By the way, there's no qualification. You didn't go to college to become a rabbi. You know, there's no qualification. People called Jesus rabbi because of his knowledge, because of his learning, because of his understanding of the Bible. That's how he got called that. So what do? You are committing yourself to someone completely, to follow them. That sort of thing, when you're taking on a burden, and this was referred to back in those days as taking on the yoke of learning, the burden of learning. And that rabbi would say to his new talmid, his new disciple, are you ready to take on my burden of learning? I will blow your mind. I will weigh you down in such a volume of learning before you can really understand what I'm talking about. It may break you. Are you ready for that? And if the kid is ready and prepared to go for it, then he can become a talmid. What does Jesus say when he calls his disciples? He says, take my yoke, because my yoke is a light one. All of this is from the Jewish dialogue of the Second Temple era, and people who don't understand that don't get the most out of those verses. They don't realize this powerful relationship that's going on, not because they see him as the Son of God and God. This is doctrine, and it's later church teaching. It's because of who the person is, the human person, the human Jesus is, and what he represents to them. Again, these are things that enrich evangelicals, and they really love to hear it. Okay, so let me now, all that for coming out from, do evangelists ask what Jesus looked like? Back then, they didn't have careers guidance counseling. Okay, there was no Moetzal Ezrat Mesirut. You weren't sent to somewhere to decide, oh, I want to become a fireman, a policeman, I want to do this one. No, if your dad is a sandlar, if he's a cobbler, he makes shoes, then that's what you're going to do. If your father's a traveling trader, that's what you're going to become. If your father makes barrels, that's what you're going to do. Become a cooper. If your father makes wheels for wagons, that's what you're going to do. If your father's a tecton, you are going to become a tecton. So you want to know what Jesus was doing for 18 years? He was a tecton. He would have worked with his father, Joseph, in his father's profession, hawking big stones. Look at every painting you've ever seen of Jesus. He's this tall, spindly guy that looks like if he went, he'd fall over. He was probably well-built, strong, stacked. He walked for hundreds of kilometers. He was fit. He would have looked like a heck of a guy. So do they ask what he looked like? Yes, often. And that's the sort of answer I give them. You know, if you spent 18 years hawking stones and building scaffolding and climbing up and down buildings and going twice a year to Jerusalem back by foot, 120 kilometers there, 120 kilometers back. And then you go off in your ministry to Sidon and to Tyre and to other places. You're going to be a fit guy. Not even looking like a long distance runner either, but looking like someone who can heave weights and heavy stones. So that's the answer I give to that. I think that the verse of Luke 1:26 should be connected to verse 24. This refers to the pregnancy of Elizabeth. Again, that is looking at it through a later view. It's not the view of the time. The people at the time looked at these texts through the biblical sense, not through that's eisegesis. Okay, I'm sorry, Anton, but I don't accept that, because that's my personal view. There are other people who argue that he was born at Tabernacles. At Shavuot, at Sukkot. There's an argument for that as well. But if you follow the text and read it as a continuation, you see, the thing is this is a problem that many pastors have. They take a verse out of its context and use it to make a whole teaching of. That is not the way Jews, and all these guys were Jews, by the way, Jesus, Peter, all the disciples were Jews. They all had a Jewish education. That's not the way it works. The way it works is the way they read the Torah. You don't say, oh, today we're going to teach you Genesis chapter 21, verse 3. Chapters and verses didn't exist until the 12th century, when there were disputations between Nachmanides, Rabbi Nachman ben Nachmanides is, I forgot what his name is in Hebrew, Moshe ben Nachman, and between the Catholic cardinals over who knew the Bible properly. Then they divided it into chapters and verses. Even in the early Gospels, there were no divisions. There's no chapter and verse in the early manuscripts of the Gospels. They learned stories, complete stories. Bereshit, Noah, Lech Lecha, take yourself, the weekly readings. I often say to people, when we get to discuss the Beatitudes, where should we start reading the Beatitudes from? And many will say, well, obviously from Matthew 5:1. No, that's the middle of a story. How do you start a story with, and when he saw the crowds? Hello, what crowds? Where are they coming from? You can't start a story like that. The story starts 3 verses back in Matthew 4. And he went throughout Galilee, teaching in the synagogues, healing the sick, casting out demons, and his fame spread throughout Galilee and all of Syria. And when he saw the crowds, that's where they're coming from. You see, the divisions, just as they are in the New Testament and the Old Testament, are often not based on any form of logic. I'm talking about in the gospel chapters. I'm not talking about in the epistles. I don't go into that. But That's the sort of thing we're talking about. And if you read that section of Luke as an entire story, then you'll realize that the story of Elizabeth is finished, and it's nothing to do with the story of Mary in that sense, apart from once the visit is gone. So that, again, you can use it in that. I think Jesus used agape first. You may be right, Peter, you may be right. But the sequence doesn't seem to make as much sense as when he tries to get him up there. You mentioned Tabcha, where Jesus asked Peter. I'm not saying it's Tabcha. I don't know it's Tabcha, but it could have been there. The only place we know is mentioned something, the Dalmanuta. Well, in Tabcha of the Benedictines, they name one of their altars by the water, the Dalmanuta. Dalmanuta 1, Dalmanuta 2. I've had mass with groups at both sites, but that doesn't mean that's the Dalmanuta. We don't really know where it is. But here in the same passage, he mentions there are 153 fish in the net. I heard different explanations for this number 303. Is that something that could be interesting to evangelicals? Wow. I'm not going to take more than a couple of minutes. How many more questions have we got here? I'll come back to that because that's a big one. Genesis 22 be read differently. Why would God test Abraham? Verse 1, Elohim, the gods. Verse 3, by the gods. Anton, you're taking a misinterpretation. You know why? Because you're looking at Elohim as being plural. So I'll take you to the very first 3 words of Genesis. Bereshit bara Elohim. Bara, third person singular. He created, not they, he. Otherwise it would have been Bereshit baru Elohim. So when you read the word Elohim, it may sound like it's got a plural ending, but it is a singular verb, singular noun, and it always takes a singular verb in the Hebrew. So I'm not going to really relate to that. What's that? I could that license secure code. Okay, so I'm not going to come back to the 153. I love this bit. I've heard so many crazy explanations, pure, utter eisegesis about explanations of this passage. Think in terms of the mindset of a Jew in Galilee, what they would know, not what we know now, what they would know. What do you get? I've heard it explained 153 fish means in gematria, Ani Elohim. It adds up in gematria to Ani Elohim, provided you spell Elohim with a vav in it between the hey and the mem. Not once in the entire Hebrew Bible is it spelt that way. It's spelt with a chirik, not with a vav. So you're missing 6. So how does that work? And do you really think that some Galilee fishermen understood gematria? A practice that only developed from the 3rd and 4th centuries onwards as a major thing? I mean, that is a stupid explanation, but I hear it all the time. Why is it stupid? Because it doesn't relate to the people at the time and their mentality. How about this one? He's telling them that he can capture every fish in the world. There are 153 species of fish in the world. Yes, sure. A fisherman in Galilee who will only ever know maybe a little bit about catfish that he's not going to catch, maybe about tilapia and a few freshwater sardines that are in the Sea of Galilee. He really does know what fish are in Lake Erie in North America, or in the South China Sea, or in the Yellow River, or in the Amazon. He knows what fish are down there, doesn't he? I mean, come on. It's a lake, for heaven's sake. You're only fishing 2 months of the year. You can't make a living fishing all year round, or there'd be no fish left the next year. You'd be fishing the babies. You have to do other things for the other 10 months. Nonsense explanation. How about this one? He's saying that he can fish, i.e. bring into the church every one of the 153 nations on earth. Yeah. How many nations does this Galilean Jew know that there are in the world? Well, he's heard of the Greeks. He's heard of the Romans. He's heard of the Chitim, the Yebusi, the Perisi, and so on, and the Amori. He knows all that from the book of Deuteronomy, which he knows off by heart. Does he really know the difference between the Apache and the Comanche and the Mohicans in America? Does he know the difference in the Chinese and the Japanese or the Koreans? Again, it's an explanation taken from the 20th or 21st century. It's a wrong explanation. What is the source of knowledge of these people in their day? Their source of knowledge is what they know from their work and what they know from their memorized Bible. So if you really want to know what they're talking about, you have to go to 2 Chronicles, the only place in the entire Hebrew Bible where the number 153 is mentioned. And they would be spinning in their mind, come on, what the heck is this 153 about? And they'd be spinning, and not every one of them would know it, because not everyone learned Chronicles up by heart. They would learn Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Daniel, where the majority of the messianic prophecies are. They wouldn't necessarily know that have read it, yes. They'd have had it read to them, or rather, yes. But they think 153, 153, and one of them would drop on it, and one of them would get it. And that's enough that one of them gets it. Because I'll read to you here from 2 Chronicles, I believe it's 2:6. Yes, here we go. 2 Chronicles 2. Now, Solomon purposed to build a temple for the name of the Lord and a royal palace for himself. And as Solomon assigned 70,000 men to bear burdens, schleppers, carriers, 80,000 to quarry, that's the people hacking the stones out the mountainside, and 3,600 to oversee them. Okay, let's jump. We need to read the whole passage, but then we're going to jump ahead, still in 2 Chronicles 2, to verse 17. Then Solomon counted all the resident Goyim, aliens it says here, who were in the land of Israel, after the census of them that his father David had taken. And there were found to be 153,600. I've said that, and someone has said to me, so why weren't there 153,600 fish in the net? I'm like, yeah, really? There probably aren't that number in the whole lake. It's enough, the 153. It's a remez, it's a hint. 70,000 of them to bear burdens, 80,000 to quarry, and 3,600 as overseers to make the people work. What's actually going on here? The preparation work for the construction of the sanctuary to God in Jerusalem was not done by Jews. It was done by the Gentiles in the land, because the number of Gentiles ties up to exactly the number who were employed in doing the hard work of the quarrying and carrying for the construction of Solomon's temple. In other words, that could be a hint by Jesus that the next temple is going to be built for the Jews by the Gentiles, or built for all the people on earth by the Gentiles. But the initiative is going to come from the Gentiles. That is a reasonable interpretation, but whether he's referring to 153 as anything else, that's the only possibility. Right, enough. Open the mics. Anyone who wants to ask another question, shoot. Again, this is all stuff that comes out of lots of, I was really ignorant when I got my license many years ago. It's not until I had to work with these people and I realized I didn't know my Bible well enough that I had to sit and study. And you have to look at different translations, because there's just so much that doesn't quite sound right. Okay. People are awake in this house, so I can now take off these ridiculous headphones. Ears are now squashed. Okay. Please, anyone who wants to ask a question. Arya.
כן, מי רוצה? בבקשה, תרימו יד. אדריאן, היית כל כך ברור שאין שאלות.
וואלה, לא יכול להיות. אף אחד? Nobody?
רגע,
Nobody got
הנה.
any questions? Or I bored you? Have I bored you?
הנה, סמיר מסמן שהוא רוצה. סמיר, שאלה, לא ויכוחים תיאולוגיים, בסדר? שאלה.
איפה נע?
תפעיל את המיקרופון. רגע, שנייה, אני אשחרר אתכם. כן, אתם יכולים עכשיו להפעיל את המיקרופונים, סליחה. עכשיו אתם יכולים. סמיר ראשון, תפעיל את המיקרופון.
Hello,
Yes.
can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Well, I just want to say something, to add up to the last thing that you mentioned about 153. Some scholars, they explain that it's from the Bible. 153 fish were fished by the disciples, 153 nation language, and 153 feet depth of the sea. This is some personal meaning about it. Now, my question was
modern interpretation. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Do you want to answer, Adrian, or shall I ask the other question? Only one more question.
My only answer to that is that both of those concepts come from a modern globalist view of the world. The people who lived in the Galilee did not know anything beyond the Galilee and maybe Jerusalem and maybe Samaria or the King's Route on the other side where they went. They did not know anything about any other nation in any other part of the world. Therefore, that interpretation is eisegesis, pure eisegesis, and not correct because it's not going through their mindset. It's interpreting what we know. We know every country in the world today. We can tell you the name of the country in the south of China and in the Southeast Asia and anywhere in Africa. We can tell you that because we know that. That's our world. We can know how many nations there are. A fisherman in Galilee could not know 2,000 years ago. So it's not, it cannot be the correct interpretation. It's a nice one, yes, I accept that, but it cannot be the right one. Next question.
And one more, Adrian, 153, if you add up 1 + 5, 6, plus 3, 9, miracles took place in Capernaum. Okay? Some people, they say that. My question was, please, that
it's a nice one.
Evangelical Christians, when they come over here, we don't have to deny other places for them. Because my friend Tony had a group 10 times the tour host was here, and they never end up to be in the Holy Sepulchre Church. And the man was amazed, and he said, why they don't take us to a meaningful place like that? It happened with me the same. That's my question, is that why do we have to hide the reality from those evangelical Christians? Thank you for everything.
Okay, that's a good question. Darling, later, the noise is picked up by the mic later. The best answer I can give you to that is I have been with some extreme groups who, even when I tried to convince them that I would like to show them things in the Holy Sepulchre, not the altars, not the icons, but to take them down into Helena's chapel and show them the cisterns, show them the quarry from Herod's time, show them the inscription, which is behind the wall underneath St. Martin's chapel, which is with the fishing boat. Someone's got a bit of noise going on in the background there. Hang on. Let me just close whatever.
סגרתי את המיקרופונים הפתוחים.
Okay.
אתה יכול להמשיך? השאלות הבאות, מורסי ביקש ואחר כך פיטר.
Okay, so I talk about that when I say I want to show you slot tombs, kivrei kuchim, because the gospel is very specific, very specific. In John's own gospel, he described how he runs ahead of Peter and how Mary Magdalene stoops to look into the tomb. Why she stoops? Because you can't see, because it's low down, because it's a slot tomb. And I show them in the Syrian chapel. And if I get a chance, I go into the Coptic area. Sometimes they let you in there. And there's more of them there. This was a first century burial site. And I want them to see what real first century burial sites look like, not the garden tomb with its huge chamber that's typical of the time of Jeremiah. So, but sometimes I've got a pastor who is absolutely adamant. We're not going near that place. We're not going. Most are not like that. These are usually the pastors who are very ignorant. They're not got any education. They've come to being pastors because when I say education, I mean no education in archaeology, no education in other languages. They're people who are very good pastors. They work with people who've got problems, especially people who come to faith from drug abuse, alcoholism, and things like that. And they tend to be very, very strict, and they don't want to go there. I try and convince people to go there. And yes, they go to the garden tomb too, and they say to me, what do you think about the garden tomb? And I tell them the truth. I tell them what every single archaeologist in Jerusalem says about the garden tomb, that it's a first century burial system with secondary use in the Byzantine era and had no relevance in the first century. They talk there about, the Damascus Gate. For heaven's sake, Hadrian built the Damascus Gate 100 years after the crucifixion. There was no gate in the northern wall. Who created the quarry? Herod, when he had to create a cliff face so that the northern wall, which wasn't protected by a valley, would have a big open space and that nobody could undermine his wall because it was sitting on a rock. There's all this logic that's there, and sometimes they just don't want to hear. So I work with many Pentecostal groups that want to go to the Holy Sepulchre, but they want to see the archaeology. They're not interested in every stuff, as they call it, that's going on there. They want to see the archaeology. So I take them into the Syrian chapel, I take them into Helena's chapel, and I talk about what the place looked like. And if I can, I take them up onto the roof of the Petra Hotel so they can see where Hezekiah's, or what's referred to as the Hezekiah's pool is, and they can see the layout, and that it was bang outside the city. It wasn't inside the city. We showed them the first wall. They know exactly where it is. Many of them have got open minds to that, but some of them have got very close minds to that. And those of them that go there and find the place disturbing because of all the stuff that's going on, I simply say to them, take the atmosphere of the garden tomb and do copy paste to the Holy Sepulchre. No church, no building, no construction, no temple to Venus, nothing. Just an open, abandoned quarry on Herod's death. 37 years later or thereabouts, it's an abandoned quarry, it's free land, and anyone can make a hole in a rock face and use it as a slot tomb. So
it's good for meditation.
Sorry?
It's good for meditation. The
Yeah,
garden tomb.
It's good for meditation and prayer. And you want to, and that was what it would have been like going to the tomb. When Mary Magdalene went to the tomb, that's what it was like. It was like the atmosphere you got in the garden tomb. But that is not a second temple tomb, I'm sorry. So I tell them the truth. I say copy paste. I mean, you have to deal with some people are very, very blinkered. They don't want to know about the Holy Sepulchre. And I think it's wrong, yeah.
טוב, עוד שאלות, סמיר, בבקשה, תן לאנשים עוד לשאול שאלות. מורסי, בבקשה, תפתח את המיקרופון.
איפה אתה, אחי?
אהלן, מורסי.
As always, I enjoy every bit of this seminar. And thank you for that. My questions are two. First, it would be about how important the temple outside the historical mean to the temple to them. And the second thing, you have mentioned that the sacrifice usually takes over the oldest son. And in that case, Ismail is the oldest son.
Yeah. I don't really go there because the Dead Sea Scrolls in the chapter 22 of Genesis is no different than it is today. So his wife was Sarah, and Hagar was his wife's servant. And it says also, there's all the blessings on Ishmael and on Hagar that take place in the book of Genesis. But that specifically sort of talks about Isaac. And I know that the Quran tells that story differently. If I was with an Islamic group, I would obviously relate to that, and not relate to what the book of Genesis says, because that's what they know. But you don't need evangelicals never ask that question. For them, this is the word of God. This is the perfect thing. This is the right thing. And what was your other question? The importance of going to the Temple Mount. Some of them really want to go there. A lot of groups want to go. A lot of groups do go there. If you go down at 7:30 in the morning when there's big tourism periods, you will see massive lines going all the way out to the Dung Gate and all the way down into almost to the opposite Davidson Center, lining up to go into the Temple Mount. Why do they want to go there? They want to go there because according to the Bible, according to the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, in the book of 1 Kings, when Solomon is blessing the people and trying to inaugurate the work, as it's called, the avodah in the temple, where they start with the sacrifice, which are not, only 12% of sacrifices were animal. It was only mainly at festivals. It was the vast majority. People would bring wheat, barley, wine, anything, wine from Cyprus even. When that's happening, we take there's another section of this, another description of this that's in the book of Chronicles. In the book of Chronicles, it says, pardon me, it says that the presence of God descended in a cloud upon the sanctuary that Solomon had built. and filled it with so much powerful light that the Kohanim, the descendants of Aaron, the priests, couldn't enter the building for 3 days, blinded by the divine light. And because this is the only place, this is very different for Christians and Jews. For Jews, the only thing that's holy in Jerusalem is where the divine presence was during the Temple of Solomon, not the rocks. The rocks don't mean anything. You know, I know that, you know, you've got a sign up there that the rabbinical authorities say the divine presence is now in the Western Wall. I mean, you can accept that or not accept that. For me, forget it. Nobody can officially tell me that's moved over there. I don't, that's for me. And I'm more in line with the evangelicals on that. But the fact is that that's where it was. So the evangelicals are aware of that. And that's why they want to go near to it. For the same reason that they want to go to near where the tabernacle may have stood in Shiloh. Because for them, they try to think, no, can I feel God's presence here where he manifested himself more than I can feel it back home in Missouri? It's that's what takes them there. That's what makes them want to go there. So many groups want to go there, yeah. It's funny, actually. I'll tell you a really funny, this is a really crazy story, actually. I had a family, just a family. The mother grew up evangelical, okay? And she went on what's called some sort of program where you go and work in poor countries and help people. And she ended up in Gaza, working with UNRWA as part of this program. And she met a Muslim doctor from Gaza, right? They ended up going to America and getting married. She stayed with her belief and he stayed with his belief. They never really, you know, they never connected in terms of faith, but the children obviously were raised as Muslim. Okay, so I'm with the daughter, who's this very funny, she's like blonde hair, blue eyes, tall girl. The father had passed away, so I'm with her and the girl. And I said to them, if we want to go up on the Temple Mount, it's got to be at certain times. So the mother said, well, you know, I'd really like to go there. And the daughter was like, of course I've got to go there. You know, this is where Muhammad ascended to heaven. So I went up there with them. And it was fascinating because for each of them, that site had a great importance. Seen through different lenses, but they had great importance. But I can't say that every group goes there. There are a lot who just can't, they can't, sometimes in season like May, November, you can be an hour and a half in line. They can't afford the time. So they pass on it or they don't go there. Okay.
Adrian?
Yes, Peter.
3 questions. The first one is a simple, this or that.
Yeah, you're challenging
me. Would you
me
rather guide a Catholic group or an evangelical group?
I don't, you know, I enjoy anyone of faith, okay? I would say 85% of my work is with evangelical groups, 12% is with Catholic groups, and 3% is with Jewish families.
Okay.
But the Catholic groups I work with, I enjoy immensely. I like the priests. One of them is with a theologian, a Catholic theologian who's a lay teacher who brings a Marian tour and walks them through the rosary site after site. I think it's wonderful to work with people who've got great faith. I enjoy it all.
Okay.
You know, and I speak to them through with their language when I'm guiding them. Very different to working with them when I'm working with evangelicals. I think you know you've all done this. You know the differences.
Yeah, I know. Question 2, my friend. Since we don't live in a void, and this is bound to come now and then.
Yeah.
How do we deal and how do we approach the Palestinian-Israeli conflict? That's one. And then how do we deal with the questions of American politics, if ever? Because you think, you know, for example, a lot of these evangelicals will, because they are the base of Trump, and then he lost and all of that happens, and now Biden is in, and then how do you deal with all of this? Should we or should we not?
I don't think it's good. I believe in non-political guiding. I believe in being non-political and being pragmatic, okay?
But there are things on the ground that you see. I mean, you cannot.
Absolutely, yeah, you see things on the ground. But first of all, the Trump issue was only it was a 4-year blip. Okay, I know plenty of evangelicals who have always supported the Democratic Party.
Mm-hmm.
I know plenty of Catholics who are out and out Republicans. I don't go there unless it's joking in the evening. You know, I mean, I think you can be a lot more open with a Catholic priest when you're having a beer in the evening than you can with an evangelical pastor. They're a lot more laid back and cool, and they'll joke about just about anything. I try not to get into politics. Yes, when I go into Bethlehem or to Jericho, Jericho's a bit of a problem because there aren't that many good guides there. But Bethlehem, I work with guides in Bethlehem, only work with guides. I never guided Bethlehem, who understand how to speak to evangelicals. In other words, I don't go there with a guide who starts saying, welcome to the birthplace of Jesus Christ our Lord, this is where the Virgin Mary, blah, blah, blah. As soon as they say that, the whole group switches off. They don't want to know from this guy, right? The other thing is that often you end up with a driver who gets very disappointed because these groups go to all these shops and all they see is graven images and they don't want any of it. So you have to know how to deal with them. So they get disappointed because they don't buy that sort of stuff. They buy other stuff. The other thing is, I let the local.
אדריאן, נעלמת. אדריאן, נעלמת לנו. לא שומעים אותך.
Anyone hear me?
עכשיו כן.
Okay. I think there are, it says my internet connection is unstable, unfortunately.
גם ככה צריך להתחיל לסיים, אני רוצה גם להגיד משהו, זו תהיה שאלה אחרונה.
Go for it. Last question. You get drawn into politics. I never do it on the bus. If I discuss politics, it's usually 1-to-1, 2-to-3, or whatever, with a small group, because you don't want that to overshadow. I've had groups and pastors who took us to that place on the wall, right next to the wall, where all where the drawing of Trump is. I forget what it's called, In on the Wall or something like that. And they get their view of that, and then they ask me about that. It's very interesting who you end up speaking to, but I try not to get distracted by that. But I will discuss it with people and discuss it. I just won't make it my policy. I'm not, a teacher of this or that to do with politics.
טוב, חברים, אני חושב שזאת הייתה השאלה האחרונה, אנחנו כבר ב-2:10. אני רוצה להגיד כמה דברים. קודם כל, כמובן, בראש ובראשונה להודות לאדריאן על השתלמות מרתקת, ועל ההשקעה שלו גם בתרגום של המצגת וכל מה שהוא עשה. דבר נוסף, אני רוצה להודות לכם שהשתתפתם והקשבתם, וגם הייתם ילדים טובים, שלחתם את הקודים בזמן, הכל טוב. אני כמובן מעביר דיווח למשרד התיירות, כל האנשים שהיו פה גם ראיתי שהשתתפו לאורך כל הסמינר, וזה בסדר גמור. אגודת מורי הדרך מפעילה עוד כמה השתלמויות. נשארו לנו...
עוד משהו. אחר כך, אריה, עוד דבר אחרון על המצגת.
ניתן לאדריאן תכף. אני אגיד רק עוד שני דברים חשובים. אחד, יש לנו עוד השתלמויות, גם בזום, ועכשיו גם חזרנו לשטח, ויוצאת השתלמות גם של אדריאן באתרים בירושלים. ב6 באפריל, שזה היה אמור להיות במהלך השנה ונדחה בגלל הקורונה, שלחתי לכם בצ'אט את הקישור, אני אשלח אותו עוד פעם, קישור להרשמה למי שרוצה לשמוע את אדריאן עוד פעם, והפעם בשטח בירושלים, אז אתם מוזמנים להיכנס לקישור ולהירשם, יש עוד מקומות. יש ביום ראשון השתלמות נוספת של אדריאן, אבל שם כבר אין מקומות, אני לא יכול להכניס אף אחד, יש אפילו רשימת ההמתנה. אז שם אף אחד לא יוכל להיכנס לשומרון, אבל בירושלים יש עוד מקומות, זה דבר חשוב. ודבר נוסף, אתם תקבלו ממני מייל, ממש בסוף ההשתלמות הזאת, במהלך היום, שיהיה שם קישור למשוב. אז משרד התיירות ממש מבקש שאנחנו נמלא משובים, כל אחד מכם. זה מאוד מאוד עוזר לנו לשפר את התוכניות שלנו לשנה הבאה, גם להגיב קצת על הנושא של ההשתלמויות עצמם, אם זה היה לכם יעיל, איך היה הארגון וכל הדברים האלה. אני ממש מבקש מכם למלא את המשובים האלה ולשלוח אותם חזרה למשרד התיירות. זה פשוט קישור שעונים עליו פחות מדקה. שם איזה 4 או 5 שאלות, אז בבקשה תעשו את זה. ודבר נוסף, אני מזמין אתכם גם להשתלמויות אחרות, לא רק של אדריאן. יש גם השתלמויות לחידוש רישיון, יש גם השתלמויות העשרה, ואגודת מורי הדרך שמחה לראות את כל מורי הדרך, לא רק מי שחבר. במייל שאני אשלח, אז יש גם כמה שבטעות מילאו את ההרשמה להשתלמות הזאת בסעיף של חברים, אבל הם לא חברים, אז צריך לעשות איזושהי תוספת. זה אני אעשה באופן אישי מול כל אחד. ואני מחזיר חזרה לאדריאן להגיד את מילותיו האחרונות, ואז לסיים את הסמינר הזה.
Okay. I don't want to keep you for too long, but there is a question here from Valerie that I didn't get to answer. How do you deal with sites with their own guides who teach things that are not correct, like the age of the garden tomb? Maybe the volunteers in the garden tomb are also pastors, but they're not the pastor of my group. So I have no problem with contradicting all the nonsense that they may talk about there. No problem whatsoever. And I often do it on the bus before I even get there. Okay, because people want to believe that's the real place, because that's their place. Sorry, folks. And last, somebody's asking here, Paul, about the 10-day course. I'm gonna share screen again just for a few moments so you can make some notes. This is not just me. I'm just the coordinator, the rakaz of this course. The course is a series of 3-day lectures, 3 days of lectures on Zoom, unfortunately. This is now the third time we're running the course in 16 months. It's been full every time of 43 guides. Most of the lectures are in English. One is done by an archaeologist who works in Israel. She's from Australia. She's really good, and she talks about Iron Age connection to biblical sites and so on. 7 of the lectures are by the Professor Wade Nunnery, who's the guy with the quotation I showed you in the last slide. 2 of the lectures are by Omer Eshel, who has got his own company that brings in evangelical groups from the North Central America, mainly from the area around the Midwest. That's basically 3 days of lectures on Zoom. Now, it's very hard to be all day long in Zoom with 4 lectures of an hour and a half for the 2 academic hours. However, it's all recorded. It's all available on Omer Eshel's site, on the Bible Comes to Life site. You can look at it in the evening if you want. What we're doing this time round, which is why we've been able to make it cheaper than the second round, is we're using those recordings. We're paying royalties to the people who do the, Professor Nunley who's doing this. We're no longer having to set him up with a very expensive technical background in a university in Missouri. But every day live at around 5 p.m. every day, he will be doing questions and answers. And there's one lecture he's doing that's never been done before. The 7 days of tours are tours. The tour that we're doing through for the renewal of the license on Sunday in the Shomron, that is one day that I do on that tour. I also do the day around the Sea of Galilee, the Lower Galilee, and the Jezreel Valley is led by Eyal Miron. The Jordan Valley and the areas and the area around Nebi Samuel, that area is led by Chilik Abergil. The tour of the old city in the old city of Jerusalem was previously led by Shachar Shiloh, but he is now so heavily involved in a tourism project in the south that he can't be with us this time. So I've given that this time to Eyal Miron, who's also brilliant in the old city. We cover lots of areas. We do Omer Eshel does a whole tour through the Shfilat Yehuda, all the ancient tells, and it's all biblical. The whole concept of this course is not to teach you theology, not to bore you with art and prefigurations and all that stuff, but to give you practical stuff to be able to use with evangelical groups, to give you content to use with the evangelical groups, to be able to understand the arguments they come with or they may ask you about. It's entirely tools of work. It's not some let me learn more and become a greater scholar course. Okay, so I'm going to share the screen with the details because the registration is through the University of Haifa's Tourism School.
אדריאן, אני ממילא שולח להם מייל עם המשוב, אז תשלח לי קישור להרשמה לקורס הזה, אני אשלח להם גם את זה.
אוקיי, אנחנו נשלח להם את המצגת גם, אז יהיה להם את ה...
מצוין, אין בעיה.
Yeah, go to the last slide. You've got my number, you've got the number for the University of Haifa and their email address.
אני אשלח לכם את הכל במייל, יחד עם המצגת ויחד עם המשוב, עם הקישור למשוב שצריך למלא.
אוקיי.
אפשר בעברית?
אפשר בעברית, מה?
טוב, חברים...
סליחה, all the tours are led in Hebrew. All the 7 days are in Hebrew.
הסיורים בעברית. טוב, חברים, בזה אנחנו בעצם מסיימים. אני סימנתי כל מי שהיה עד הסוף. אני אשלח את הדוחות, את הקישור. אני שוב מודה לאדריאן. אתם מוזמנים למי שרוצה גם, חוץ מהמשוב של משרד התיירות, כשתקבלו מייל, אתם מוזמנים להשיב לי, אם אתם רוצים להגיד משהו, אפשר גם להגיד דברים טובים אם אתם רוצים, ושאנחנו נלמד מזה. ושיהיה כל טוב לכולם, ותצטרפו לעוד סיורים והשתלמויות של אגודת מורי הדרך. תודה רבה לכם על ההשתתפות.
אריה, אתה עכשיו קוד גם שולח?
מה אני שולח?
קוד. שאנחנו מסיימים, גם שולח קוד?
לא, בפגישה האחרונה לא צריך קוד. מה ששלחתם עד עכשיו זה מספיק.
מספיק, תודה רבה.
תודה רבה. יום טוב לכולם.
תודה לכולכם, תודה רבה לכולם.
תודה רבה.
אריה, שאלה אישית, אני הצטרפתי לי עכשיו, קצת כמה דקות יותר מאוחר, זה הכל בסדר, פקר אליינה?
כן, זה בסדר גמור, אני סימנתי שהיית כל היום.
כן, כמה דקות פשוט הייתה הבנה, חיכיתי ו...
אין בעיה. אין בעיה.
חני, מה שלומך?
כל בסדר, כל כך מרתק, וואו, אני כל כך נהניתי מכל רגע, וואו, תודה רבה, תודה רבה, ממש.
אני תמיד עם חיוך, זה מה שמדהים, אני כל הזמן מחייך.
למה לא? טוב, איזה כיף היה, ממש.
טוב מאוד.
תודה רבה לכם.
טוב, חברים.
תודה שהקשבתם.
כל טוב לכם, תודה אדריאן. יש לך עבודה קשה לקראת יום ראשון, סיור בשומרון.
כן.
נדבר עוד מעט.
ביי.
ביי, שלום לכולם.
זהו, נתראה בדרכים. שיחזרו התיירים, אינשאללה, כאילו.
We don't want to go, that's the problem. We're still waiting for you to carry on.
I'm going to leave.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye, Adrian.